Blood soaked through Kalen Voss's shirt as he ran through the frozen trees, his boots crashing through snow that had not melted in weeks. Behind him, 4 shapes moved fast between the trunks, their footsteps sharp and steady, closing the gap with every second. He could hear his own heartbeat pounding louder than his breath. His left shoulder burned where the first bullet had struck him, a pain unlike anything he had felt before. It was not the clean pain of a blade or the dull ache of a fist. This pain spread through his veins like fire, slow and endless, because the bullet inside him was made of silver. Kalen was the Alpha King of the Northern Packs, a ruler stronger than any man or wolf in the region, a leader whose word carried the weight of law across 100 miles of forest and mountain. But none of that mattered now. Silver did not care about titles. Silver did not bow to strength. It moved through his body like poison, weakening his muscles, slowing his mind, stealing the power that had always kept him safe. He had walked into the summit that night believing in peace. The leaders of 3 packs had gathered at his invitation, seated around a long wooden table, sharing food and words meant to end years of conflict. He had trusted the process. He had trusted the men who sat across from him, especially Garrett Thorne, a pack leader from the Eastern Hills, who had always spoken of unity. That trust had been a mistake. The first shot came from the shadows outside the meeting hall, fired the moment Kalen stepped out into the night air. He remembered the flash of light, the sudden burning impact in his shoulder, and the shouts that followed. He remembered running, some part of his mind still functioning enough to know that standing still meant death. He had been chased before, hunted by rivals hoping to steal his throne, but never with silver. Silver was a weapon meant to kill wolves who could otherwise heal from almost anything. Now, hours later, or maybe only minutes, he could not tell anymore. His legs were growing heavy. The forest around him blurred at the edges. He pushed forward anyway, weaving between trees, trying to put distance between himself and the men hunting him. But he could feel his body slowing, could feel the strength that had defined his entire life, draining away with every step. A second gunshot cracked through the night. He felt the impact this time in his side, and pain exploded through him so intensely that he stumbled and nearly fell. He caught himself against a tree trunk, gasping, his vision swimming. 2 silver bullets now lived inside him, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him more than the winter air, that he would not survive a third. He forced himself to keep moving, dragging his body forward through the snow, leaving a trail of dark red behind him that would be easy to follow. He no longer had the strength to mask his scent, no longer had the speed to outrun trained hunters. All he had left was stubborn will, and even that was fading fast. The trees thinned ahead, and through the gaps, he saw a small light glowing in the distance. A window, a cabin. Shelter of some kind, though he had no way of knowing if it would help him, or simply become the place where his enemies finally caught up. But he had no other choice. His body would not carry him much farther, and if he collapsed in the open snow, he would die there, alone, betrayed by men he had once called allies. He staggered toward the light, each step slower than the last. His vision narrowed until all he could see was that single glowing window, a small square of warmth in a world that had turned cold and cruel. He did not know who lived there. He did not care. Survival had stripped away everything, except the need to reach that light, before the darkness closing in around his eyes became permanent. The cabin came into view fully now, a modest wooden structure, with smoke rising from a stone chimney. A fence surrounded a small garden, dead for the winter season, and a narrow path led up to a wooden door. Kalen's legs gave out, just as he reached the edge of the fence, and he fell hard into the snow, his breath coming out in ragged gasps. He tried to push himself up, but his arms shook too violently to support his weight. The forest spun above him, dark branches crossing a sky filled with stars that seemed impossibly far away. He heard the door of the cabin creak open. Footsteps crunched through snow, hurried and light. A voice called out, unsure at first, then sharper with concern. "Hello? Is someone there?" Kalen tried to answer, but his throat produced only a weak sound, barely more than a breath. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until a shadow fell over him, blocking the moonlight. He blinked, trying to focus on the face above him, but his vision refused to cooperate. He could make out only the shape of a person kneeling beside him in the snow, their hands hovering near his shoulder where blood had soaked through the fabric of his shirt. "You're hurt," the voice said, quieter now, steady despite the situation. It was a woman's voice, calm in a way that surprised him even through his pain. Most people panicked at the sight of blood, especially this much of it. She did not. "Can you hear me? Stay with me, okay? I need you to stay awake." He tried to nod, though he was not sure if his head actually moved. The cold from the snow beneath him had begun to feel less sharp, replaced instead by a strange numbness that frightened him more than the pain had. He knew what that numbness meant. His body was shutting down. "I'm going to get you inside," the woman said, her tone firm now, decisive. "Can you move at all? I can't carry you on my own, but if you can help me even a little, we can make this work." Kalen forced his eyes to focus, and slowly, the woman's face came into view. She looked young, perhaps in her mid-20s, with dark hair pulled back loosely, and eyes that held none of the fear he expected to see. She looked worried, yes, but not paralyzed by panic. She looked like someone who had decided, in the space of a few seconds, that she was going to help him no matter what it cost her. "Please," he managed to whisper, the single word costing him more effort than it should have. "Help." "I've got you," she said. "My name is Alira. You're safe now. Just hold on." He wanted to tell her that safety was an illusion, that the men hunting him could still be following his trail through the snow, that bringing him inside her home might put her directly in danger. But his body would not cooperate, and the words never left his mouth. Instead, he felt her arm slide beneath his good shoulder, felt her strength as she pulled him upward, guiding his weight against her own body. "Come on," she said, gritting her teeth with effort. "Just a little further. The door is right there." Somehow, between his weakened attempts to walk and her steady support, they made it across the remaining distance to the cabin. The warmth of the interior hit him immediately, a stark contrast to the frozen air outside, and for a moment, the sensation was almost overwhelming. She guided him to a worn couch near the fireplace and lowered him down as gently as she could manage, though pain still shot through his side as his body settled against the cushions. "Okay," Alira said, kneeling beside him and examining the wound on his shoulder first. Her fingers moved carefully, pulling back the torn fabric of his shirt to get a better look. Her breath caught slightly when she saw the wound clearly, the skin around it an angry red that seemed to be spreading rather than healing. "This doesn't look like a normal gunshot wound." "Something's wrong with it." Kalen said nothing. He could not explain silver poisoning to a human woman who had no idea what he truly was. He could not tell her that the metal lodged inside his body was slowly killing him in a way that no ordinary bullet ever could. All he could do was watch as she worked, her hands quick and sure despite the gravity of the situation, moving to check the second wound at his side. "2 wounds," she murmured, mostly to herself. "You lost a lot of blood getting here. I need to clean these and stop the bleeding, but I think—" She paused, studying the wounds more closely, her brow furrowing in confusion. "I think something needs to come out first. There's something still in there. I can see it." She rose quickly, moving to a cabinet on the far wall, and returned moments later with a small metal box that she opened to reveal supplies, bandages, bottles of dark liquid, and small instruments that looked handmade rather than store-bought. She knelt beside him again, her expression focused and determined. "This is going to hurt," she warned him. "I don't have anything strong enough to numb it properly. I'm sorry." "Do it," he whispered, bracing himself. What followed was a blur of pain sharper than anything Kalen had experienced in his long life as Alpha King. Alira worked with careful precision, extracting the bullet from his shoulder first, her hands steady despite the way his body tensed and shuddered beneath her touch. He gritted his teeth, refusing to cry out, though the effort left him trembling and drenched in sweat. When the silver fragment finally came free, dropping into a small dish with a soft metallic sound, he felt an immediate, undeniable shift. The fire in his veins did not vanish, but it eased slightly, as though a valve somewhere in his body had loosened, just enough to let him breathe. "One more," Alira said quietly, moving to the wound at his side. "Stay with me." The second extraction was worse than the first, and Kalen felt his consciousness slipping at the edges, darkness threatening to pull him under completely. But Alira's voice remained a constant thread pulling him back, calm and encouraging, even as her hands worked through delicate, painful movements. "Almost there," she said. "You're doing so well. Just a little more." When the second piece of silver finally came free, Kalen felt something inside him release entirely. A tension he had not realized he was holding suddenly gone. The pain remained, sharp and present, but the poisoning that had been spreading through his system began, slowly, to recede. He could feel his mind clearing, just slightly, enough to understand that he had survived the most immediate danger. Alira cleaned both wounds thoroughly, applying a dark paste from one of her bottles that stung fiercely but seemed to soothe the inflamed skin almost immediately. She wrapped each wound with careful precision, her movements practiced in a way that suggested this was not the first time she had tended to an injury like this, even if the injury itself was unlike anything she had likely seen before. "There," she said finally, sitting back on her heels and studying her work with a critical eye. "That should hold for now. You need rest, real rest, not whatever brought you running through the woods in the middle of the night bleeding like that." Kalen studied her face, searching for signs of fear or suspicion, but found only genuine concern, mixed with quiet curiosity. She had no idea what she had just done. She had no idea that the man lying on her couch was not entirely human, that the metal she had pulled from his body was the one substance capable of ending his existence permanently. She had simply seen someone hurt, and acted without hesitation, without asking questions that might have given her every reason to turn him away. "Thank you," he said, his voice still weak but steadier than before. "You didn't have to help me." "Of course I did," Alira replied, as though the answer were obvious. "You were dying in my front yard. What kind of person would I be if I just let that happen?" He wanted to tell her that most people would have called for help, would have kept their distance from a stranger covered in blood, would have questioned why he was even out in the forest in the first place, instead of simply diving in to save him. But exhaustion pulled at him too strongly to form the words, and his eyes began to close despite his effort to stay alert, to stay aware of any danger that might still be approaching. "Rest," Alira said softly, noticing the way his eyelids drooped. "I'll keep watch. Nothing is going to hurt you here." As Kalen finally allowed himself to drift towards sleep, his mind lingered on one thought above all others. The men hunting him were still out there, somewhere in the frozen forest, and eventually, they would find the trail of blood leading directly to this cabin. Eventually, the danger that had nearly killed him would arrive at Alira's door, and she would be caught in the middle of a conflict she knew nothing about. But for now, in this moment, warmth surrounded him. His pain had eased, and a stranger with steady hands and a fearless heart had given him a chance to survive the night. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows gently, as snow continued to fall over the trail of blood that led straight from the tree line to the cabin door. Somewhere beyond the ridge, 4 hunters moved through the darkness, following that same trail with grim determination, unaware that the woman inside the cabin had already changed everything, and unaware that the wolf they hunted had found, without either of them realizing it yet, exactly the kind of protection that Silver could never touch. Alira did not sleep that night. She sat in the wooden chair beside the couch, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, watching the rise and fall of the stranger's chest to make sure it did not stop. Every few minutes, she checked his bandages, pressing gently against the fabric to see if fresh blood had soaked through. It had not yet, and she allowed herself small moments of relief each time she confirmed it. She had never seen wounds like his before. She had grown up in these woods, had patched up her share of cuts and scrapes from farm accidents and the occasional hunting mishap, but nothing had prepared her for the sight of metal fragments buried deep in human flesh, fragments that seemed to poison the tissue around them in a way normal bullets never did. She thought of her grandmother, who had taught her which plants could stop bleeding and which roots could fight infection, knowledge passed down through generations of women who lived far from any hospital and had to rely on themselves. She was grateful for that knowledge now, grateful that instinct alone had guided her hands toward the right remedies, even though she could not explain why they worked so well on wounds she did not understand. Around midnight, a sound outside made her sit up straight, every muscle in her body tensing. Footsteps, distant but distinct, crunching through the snow somewhere beyond the tree line. She rose quietly, moving to the window, and peered out into the darkness. For a long moment, she saw nothing but shadows and swaying branches. Then, briefly, a shape moved between 2 trees, too large and too deliberate to be a deer, or any other forest creature she recognized. Her heart pounded as she stepped back from the window, glancing at the man sleeping on her couch. Whoever had hurt him was still out there, and if they were searching the woods, it would not take long for them to notice the trail of blood leading directly to her home. She moved to the door and checked the lock, then extinguished the lamp near the window, plunging the room into near darkness except for the dim glow of the dying fire. She waited, barely breathing, listening for any sign that the footsteps were drawing closer. Minutes passed in agonizing silence. Then, slowly, the sounds faded, moving away from the cabin rather than toward it. Whoever had been out there had turned in a different direction, at least for now. Elira allowed herself a shaky breath of relief, though she knew the danger had not truly passed. Morning would bring daylight, and daylight would make the trail of blood impossible to miss. She spent the rest of the night in the chair, drifting in and out of light sleep, waking at every small sound the cabin made as it settled against the cold. When the first gray light of dawn began filtering through the curtains, she rose stiffly, her body aching from the uncomfortable position, and checked on her patient again. His breathing had steadied further overnight, and though his skin remained pale, some color had returned to his face that had not been there before. She made her way to the kitchen and began preparing a simple broth, something easy on the stomach for whenever he woke. As she worked, her mind kept returning to unanswered questions. Who was this man? Why had someone shot him, not once but twice, with what appeared to be deliberately cruel intent? And why did his wounds react so strangely to her remedies, healing at a pace that seemed almost too fast for the severity of his injuries? She glanced toward the window again, watching the tree line where she had seen movement the night before. The forest looked peaceful now, blanketed in fresh snow, giving no indication of the danger that had passed so close to her home. But she knew better than to trust that peace completely. Whoever had hunted the stranger on her couch would not simply give up. They would come back, and when they did, Elira understood, with a clarity that surprised her, that she would have to decide how far she was willing to go to protect a man she barely knew. The broth finished simmering just as she heard a low groan from the living room. She hurried back, finding the stranger's eyes fluttering open, disoriented and searching the unfamiliar surroundings before finally settling on her face. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching between them filled with unspoken questions. Neither was quite ready to voice. "You're awake," Elira finally said, offering a small, encouraging smile despite the exhaustion weighing on her. "That's a good sign. How are you feeling?" He shifted slightly, wincing at the movement, but his eyes remained alert, sharper now than they had been in the snow the night before. "Alive," he said simply. "Thanks to you." "Don't thank me yet," she replied, moving closer to check his bandages again. "You still have a long way to go before you're fully healed, and there's something I think you should know." His expression shifted immediately, tension returning to his features. "What is it?" "Someone was out there last night," she said, keeping her voice steady despite the concern lacing through it. "Near the tree line. I don't know who, but they were close. Whoever hurt you, they're still looking." The stranger's jaw tightened, and for a moment, something flickered behind his eyes that Elira could not quite name. Fear, perhaps, or something closer to grim determination. He pushed himself up slightly against the couch cushions, ignoring the visible pain the movement caused him. "You need to stay away from the windows," he said, his voice low and urgent. "If they find this place, if they find me here, you'll be in danger too. I never should have come here. I put you at risk just by existing in your home." "You didn't have a choice," Elira replied firmly, refusing to let him take on guilt that was not his to carry. "You were bleeding to death in the snow. I wasn't going to leave you there, and I'm not going to abandon you now, just because things might get complicated." He studied her for a long moment, something in his expression softening slightly, despite the tension still evident in his shoulders. "You don't even know my name," he said quietly. "You don't know anything about me, and yet you're willing to put yourself at risk for a complete stranger." "I know enough," Elira said simply. "I know you were running from something that wanted you dead, and I know that whatever it was, you didn't deserve it. That's enough for me right now." He seemed to consider her words carefully, and for the first time since waking, something that might have been the beginning of trust crossed his features. "Kaelin," he said finally. "My name is Kaelin." "Elira," she replied, though she had already told him the night before. unsure if he had been conscious enough to remember. "It's nice to properly meet you, Kaelin, even under these circumstances." A ghost of a smile touched his lips, quickly replaced by seriousness, as his mind returned to the danger still lurking beyond the cabin walls. "Elira, listen to me carefully. The people hunting me, they won't stop. Not until they're certain I'm dead. If they find this trail, if they connect it to your home, they will come here, and they will not hesitate to hurt anyone standing between them and their target." "Then we'll be careful," Elira said, her voice firm, despite the fear creeping into her chest at his warning. "We'll figure something out. But right now, you need to rest and let your body heal. You can't run from anything in the state you're in, and neither of us is thinking clearly enough to make good decisions on an empty stomach and no sleep." She retrieved the broth from the kitchen and helped him sit up enough to eat, watching carefully as he took slow, careful sips. Color continued returning to his face with each passing minute, and though exhaustion remained evident in his eyes, something steadier had settled into his expression, a resolve that had not been there when he first collapsed in her yard. Outside, the morning sun climbed higher over the frozen forest, casting long shadows between the trees, where, unseen by either of them, a set of tracks led back toward the tree line, tracks that 4 determined hunters would soon discover and follow straight toward the small cabin, where their target had found unexpected refuge, and where an ordinary woman had unknowingly stepped into a world far more dangerous and far more extraordinary than she could have ever imagined. 3 days passed before Kaelin could stand without support, and during those 3 days, Elira never once asked the questions that most people would have demanded answers to immediately. She did not ask why grown men had shot him with strange poisoned bullets. She did not ask why his wounds healed at a pace that defied everything she thought she knew about medicine. She simply cared for him, changed his bandages, brought him food, and gave him space to recover without pressure. Kaelin found himself watching her more closely with each passing day, not out of suspicion exactly, but out of a growing curiosity he could not quite explain. Something about her did not add up. Ordinary humans reacted to danger with panic or paralysis, yet Elira had moved through the crisis of his arrival with a calm efficiency that suggested either remarkable composure or something else entirely, something she herself might not fully understand. On the 4th morning, he sat at her small kitchen table, strength returning enough that he could finally hold himself upright without his arms trembling from the effort. Elira moved around the kitchen preparing tea, her movements practiced and familiar in the small space. Sunlight streamed through the window, catching on a pendant that hung around her neck, one she wore constantly, but that Kaelin had noticed her touch absently whenever she seemed lost in thought. "That necklace," he said finally, unable to hold back his curiosity any longer. "May I ask where you got it?" Elira glanced down at the pendant, her fingers brushing against the small silver wolf carved into the metal. "It was my grandmother's," she said. "She gave it to me before she passed, told me it belonged to our family for generations. I don't actually know much about its history. She died before she could explain it properly, and my parents never seemed to know either." "Interesting choice of design," Kaelin said carefully, watching her reaction. "A wolf." "I suppose so," Elira replied, setting a cup of tea in front of him and taking a seat across the table. "I never really thought much about it. It's just always been part of who I am, I guess. My grandmother used to say strange things sometimes, about our family having old blood, older than the town itself. I always assumed she meant we'd lived here a long time, nothing more than that." Kaelin kept his expression neutral, though internally, pieces were beginning to align in ways that unsettled him. Old blood. A wolf pendant, worn without understanding its significance. Herbal remedies that worked with unusual effectiveness on wounds no ordinary human medicine should have been able to treat. None of these things alone proved anything, but together, they painted a picture he was not yet ready to voice aloud, especially not to a woman who clearly had no idea what she might actually be. "Your remedies worked remarkably well," he said instead, choosing his words carefully. "Better than I expected, honestly. Where did you learn them?" "My grandmother again," Elira said, a fond smile crossing her face at the memory. "She taught me everything before she died, which plants stop bleeding, which roots fight fever, that kind of thing. We live far enough from town that relying on doctors for every little thing was never really practical. I suppose I just absorbed more of her knowledge than I realized." "It's more than knowledge," Kaelin said quietly. "What you did for me, most trained doctors would have struggled to manage. The way my wounds have healed since you treated them, it's... He paused, searching for words that would not reveal too much too soon. It's unusual. Illyra studied him for a long moment, something thoughtful crossing her expression. You keep saying things like that, she observed. Like you're surprised by how quickly you're healing, as though you expected something different. And you still haven't told me who did this to you, or why. I've given you space, because I figured you needed time to recover, but I think it's fair for me to ask now. What exactly happened to you out there? Kalen set down his cup, weighing his options carefully. He could continue offering vague explanations, could keep deflecting her questions with half-truths that satisfied nothing, or he could begin, slowly, to tell her the truth, even if the full truth remained too dangerous to share all at once. Trust, he understood, needed to be built carefully, especially when the reality he lived in defied everything a normal human would consider possible. There are people, he said finally, powerful people, who wanted me dead. Political enemies, you might call them, though the reasons run deeper than simple politics. I was betrayed by someone I trusted, ambushed during what was supposed to be a peaceful meeting. The wounds you treated, they weren't meant to simply hurt me. They were meant to kill me, permanently, in a way that regular injuries never could. What do you mean permanently? Illyra asked, her brow furrowing with confusion. A gunshot wound can absolutely kill someone permanently, Kalen. That's generally how it works. He hesitated, aware that he stood at the edge of a decision that could not be undone once made. Revealing the truth about what he was carried, risks he could not fully calculate, not yet, not while enemies still hunted him through the forest surrounding her home. But continuing to lie felt wrong, especially to the woman who had saved his life without asking for anything in return. I'm not entirely human, he said finally, watching her face carefully for any sign of fear or rejection. I know how that sounds, and I understand if you don't believe me, but it's the truth. I heal faster than ordinary people. I'm stronger, faster, more resilient to most forms of injury. Except for one substance, which is exactly what those bullets were made from. Illyra sat in silence for a long moment, processing his words with an expression that shifted between disbelief and something closer to careful consideration. Silver, she said quietly, almost to herself, her fingers unconsciously moving to touch the wolf pendant at her throat. That's an old story, isn't it? I've heard things, growing up here, old tales about creatures that live in these woods, stories my grandmother used to tell that I always assumed were just that, stories meant to keep children from wandering too far from home. They're not just stories, Kalen said gently. I'm what those tales describe, a wolf, capable of shifting between human and animal forms. My kind has lived alongside humans for centuries, mostly hidden, mostly careful to avoid detection. But conflicts between different groups of my kind exist too, just as they do among humans, and sometimes those conflicts turn violent. Illyra remained quiet, absorbing the weight of what he had just told her. Kalen watched her carefully, prepared for any reaction, fear, disbelief, perhaps even anger at having been deceived, however unintentionally, during the days she had spent caring for him, without knowing the full truth of what she was helping. You should have told me sooner, she finally said, though her tone carried more curiosity than anger. But I suppose I understand why you didn't. If what you're saying is true, trusting a stranger with information like that would be dangerous, especially so soon after being betrayed by people you already trusted. You're not frightened? Kalen asked, genuinely surprised by her measured response. Should I be? Illyra asked, meeting his eyes directly. You've been nothing but grateful and careful since I found you. If anything, learning this explains a lot of things that didn't quite make sense before. Your wounds healing faster than they should have. The way you tensed up whenever you heard sounds outside. It all fits together now. Kalen felt something shift inside him, a tension he had not realized he was carrying, easing slightly at her calm acceptance. Most humans, he knew from experience, reacted to revelations like this with fear, sometimes with outright horror. Illyra's response, practical and grounded, struck him as remarkable, though it also deepened the mystery surrounding her own nature that he had begun to suspect existed. There's something else, he said carefully, deciding that honesty, having already begun, deserved to continue. The wolf pendant your grandmother gave you, the family stories about old blood, the way your remedies worked so effectively on wounds that should have been beyond normal treatment. Alira, I don't think your grandmother's stories were simply stories. I think there's a chance your family carries bloodline connected to my kind, even if that connection has been dormant, forgotten, for generations. Alira's hand rose again to touch the pendant, her expression shifting into something more contemplative, almost distant, as though pieces of her own past were rearranging themselves into a new, unexpected pattern. That's, she started, then paused, searching for words. That's a lot to consider. I don't feel any different than I ever have. I've never shifted into anything, never experienced strength beyond what any healthy person might have. Dormant bloodlines can remain hidden for generations, Kaelin explained, sometimes never awakening at all, sometimes triggered by circumstances that force them into activity. I don't know enough about your specific situation to say for certain, but the possibility exists, and given everything else we've discussed, it seems worth considering seriously. The conversation settled into a thoughtful silence between them, both processing implications that stretched far beyond the simple rescue that had brought them together. Outside, wind rustled through the bare trees surrounding the cabin, a reminder of the world beyond their conversation, a world that still contained enemies searching for Kaelin, enemies who would not care whether Alira understood the true nature of the danger she had welcomed into her home. Whatever the truth turns out to be, Alira said finally, breaking the silence with quiet determination, it doesn't change what happened 3 nights ago. You needed help, and I gave it. I don't regret that, and knowing what you are now doesn't make me regret it either. If anything, it makes me want to understand more, about you, about my own family, about all of it. Kaelin studied her, appreciation and something warmer settling into his chest as he watched her face, steady and unafraid, despite everything she had just learned. You're remarkable, he said quietly, meaning every word. Most people would have run the moment I finished speaking. I'm not most people, Alira replied, a small smile finally breaking through her serious expression. Besides, I already pulled silver bullets out of your body with my bare hands. I think we're past the point where running away makes much sense. Their conversation might have continued longer, might have delved deeper into questions neither of them had answers to yet, but a sudden, sharp sound outside the cabin cut through the moment, freezing them both in place. Footsteps, close this time, unmistakably close, crunching through the snow just beyond the front door. Kaelin moved faster than his healing body should have allowed, rising from the table and positioning himself between Alira and the door, every instinct honed from years of leadership snapping into focus, despite his weakened state. Alira grabbed a heavy iron poker from beside the fireplace, her hands steady despite the fear evident in her eyes, and together they waited, listening as the footsteps drew closer, then paused directly outside. A soft knock sounded against the wood, followed by a familiar voice calling out, hesitant and worried. Alira? It's Owen. Are you home? I saw smoke from your chimney and wanted to check you were doing all right, what with the weather turning colder. The tension in the room broke instantly, and Alira let out a breath she had not realized she was holding, lowering the poker with a relieved laugh. It's just Owen, she said, glancing at Kaelin. He's a friend from the village, checks on me sometimes since I live out here alone. You should probably stay out of sight for now, just in case. Kaelin nodded, moving quietly toward the back room, while Alira composed herself and opened the front door, greeting the visitor with practiced warmth, despite the racing of her heart moments before. Owen stood on the porch, a middle-aged man bundled in thick winter clothing, his weathered face creased with genuine concern. I'm fine, Owen. Thank you for checking, Alira said, keeping her tone light. Just dealing with a bit of a cold, nothing serious. Owen studied her for a moment, something in his expression suggesting he sensed more than she was telling him, though he did not press further. All right then, if you're sure, you know where to find me if you need anything. The roads are getting worse with all this snow, and there's been talk in the village about strange men asking questions, searching the woods for someone. Figured you should know, given how isolated your place is out here. Alira's chest tightened at his words, though she managed to keep her expression neutral. What kind of strange men? She asked carefully. Hard to say, Owen replied, shrugging slightly. Serious-looking types, armed, moving through the forest like they knew exactly what they were searching for. Didn't seem like hunters looking for game, that's for certain. Just be careful, all right? Keep your doors locked. I will, Illyra promised, forcing a reassuring smile. Thank you for the warning, Owen. I appreciate you looking out for me. He nodded, offering a brief smile of his own, before turning and making his way back down the path toward the village, his footsteps eventually fading into the quiet of the surrounding forest. Illyra closed the door firmly, throwing the lock, and leaned against it for a moment, processing the confirmation of exactly the danger she and Kaelin had discussed only minutes before. They're getting closer, she said quietly, as Kaelin emerged from the back room, his expression grim. Owen said there are armed men searching the village, asking questions. It won't be long before they think to check every isolated cabin in the area, including this one. I need to leave, Kaelin said immediately. Though his voice carried reluctance, he could not quite hide. I can't keep putting you at risk like this. If they find me here, they won't hesitate to hurt you for helping me, regardless of whether you understood what you were getting involved in. You can barely stand for more than an hour without needing to rest, Illyra countered firmly, refusing to let him make that decision alone. Where exactly would you go, Kaelin? Back into the forest to bleed out somewhere they'll find you even faster? That's not a plan. That's surrender. He fell silent, aware that her assessment carried uncomfortable truth. His body remained far from fully healed, his strength still a fraction of what it should have been, and venturing back into the frozen forest in his current condition would likely accomplish exactly what his enemies wanted, without them needing to lift a finger. Then what do you suggest? He asked finally, frustration evident in his tone, though it was directed at the situation rather than at her. We stay smart, Illyra said, thinking quickly. We keep you hidden, keep the cabin looking as ordinary as possible, and we watch for any sign they're getting closer. If they do come here, we'll figure something out in the moment. But running now, in your condition, that's just handing them exactly what they want. Kaelin studied her, appreciation mixing with growing concern for the danger she continued to accept without hesitation. You keep making choices that put yourself at risk for someone you've known less than a week, he said quietly. I don't understand why. Maybe I don't fully understand it either, Illyra admitted, her expression thoughtful. But something about this feels right, Kaelin. Helping you, I mean. Maybe it's connected to whatever you think might be dormant in my family's blood. Maybe it's simply that I couldn't live with myself if I turned my back on someone who needed help. Either way, I'm not backing out now. As evening settled over the cabin, casting long shadows through the windows, both of them understood that the fragile peace they had built over the past few days was rapidly running out. Somewhere beyond the tree line, hunters continued their search, methodical and patient, drawing steadily closer to a small cabin that held far more than either of them had bargained for when this unlikely alliance began. The sound of an engine cutting through the quiet forest jolted Illyra awake before dawn had fully broken. She sat up sharply on the couch where she had fallen asleep beside Kaelin's makeshift bed, her heart already racing before her mind had even caught up with the source of her alarm. She moved to the window, peering carefully through a gap in the curtains, and saw exactly what she had feared. A dark vehicle had stopped at the edge of her property, and two men were climbing out, moving with the deliberate, purposeful stride of people who had finally found what they were searching for. Kaelin, she whispered urgently, crossing the room to shake him gently awake. Kaelin, they're here. He woke instantly, years of instinct overriding the exhaustion still lingering in his body. He pushed himself upright, wincing at the pain that shot through his side, and moved to the window beside her, confirming what she had already seen. Two armed men approaching the cabin, their movements careful and coordinated, the kind of coordination that spoke of extensive training rather than random searching. There will be more nearby, Kaelin said quietly, his mind already calculating options despite the fear tightening in his chest. Fear not for himself, but for the woman standing beside him, who had done nothing to deserve the danger, now arriving at her doorstep. They never travel in pairs alone when hunting something they consider dangerous. What do we do? Illyra asked, her voice steady, despite the tension radiating from her entire body. Kaelin scanned the small cabin, searching for options, for anything that might buy them time or offer a path to safety. His body remained weak, nowhere near strong enough to fight two trained hunters, let alone the additional numbers likely waiting beyond the tree line. Running was equally impossible, not with his current condition, not with the open terrain surrounding the cabin offering no meaningful cover. "The cellar," Elira said suddenly, grabbing his arm. "There's a storage cellar beneath the kitchen floor, hidden under a rug. It's small, but it should hide you long enough for me to deal with whoever's outside." "Elira, no," Kalen said immediately, alarm sharpening his voice. "You can't face them alone. These aren't ordinary men. If they suspect you're hiding me, they won't hesitate to hurt you to get answers. I can handle a conversation with two strangers claiming to be lost hikers or whatever excuse they use," Elira replied, already moving toward the kitchen, pulling back the rug to reveal a wooden trapdoor beneath. "But I can't handle them finding you here, injured and unable to defend yourself. This is the only option that gives us any chance at all." Kalen hesitated, every instinct rebelling against the idea of hiding while she faced potential danger alone. But the truth of her logic could not be denied. His presence, discovered, guaranteed disaster. His absence, at least, gave her room to maneuver, to lie convincingly, to potentially send the hunters away without incident. "If anything goes wrong," he said, gripping her hand firmly, "if you're in danger, you call out for me immediately. I don't care how weak I am, I will not let anything happen to you." Elira nodded, squeezing his hand briefly, before guiding him toward the trapdoor. He lowered himself carefully into the small, dark space beneath the kitchen floor, and she closed the door above him, just as a firm knock sounded against the front entrance of the cabin. She quickly repositioned the rug, smoothing it into place, before taking a steadying breath and making her way to answer the door. She opened it, to find two men standing on her porch, both dressed in dark, practical clothing suited for moving through winter forest terrain, both carrying themselves with the rigid alertness of people accustomed to violence. The taller of the two offered a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Good morning, miss," he said, his tone falsely pleasant. "Sorry to bother you so early. We're looking for a man. Might have come through this way in the past few days. Injured, possibly dangerous. Have you seen anyone matching that description?" "An injured man?" Elira repeated, allowing genuine confusion to color her expression, drawing on every ounce of composure she possessed. "No, I haven't seen anyone out here. I live alone, and it's been quiet all week. Is everything all right?" "Just following up on reports," the shorter man said, his eyes scanning past her into the cabin's interior with obvious suspicion. "Mind if we take a quick look around? Standard procedure, given the circumstances." Elira's stomach dropped, but she forced herself to maintain a calm exterior, understanding that any sign of hesitation would only deepen their suspicion. "Of course," she said, stepping back to allow them entry, praying silently that her voice did not betray the fear coursing through her veins. "Though I really don't have anything to hide, just my usual mess from the week." The two men moved through her small cabin with practiced efficiency, checking rooms, glancing beneath furniture, their movements methodical and thorough in a way that made Elira's pulse race faster with each passing second. She followed behind them, maintaining a facade of polite cooperation, while her mind raced through contingency plans, ready to act the moment they approached the kitchen and the hidden trapdoor beneath the rug. "Nice place," the taller man commented, his tone still carrying that false pleasantness that set Elira's nerves on edge. "Awfully isolated for a young woman living alone, though. Doesn't that concern you, being so far from the village?" "I've lived here my whole life," Elira replied, keeping her voice steady. "I know these woods better than anyone. Isolation doesn't concern me the way it might concern someone unfamiliar with the area." The shorter man had moved into the kitchen now, his eyes scanning the space with careful attention. Elira's heart pounded as he stepped closer to the rug covering the trapdoor, and she forced herself to speak, drawing his attention away before he could notice anything unusual about the flooring beneath. "Can I offer either of you something warm to drink?" she asked, her voice bright despite the panic clawing at her chest. "You must be freezing, having walked all this way through the snow." The shorter man glanced up at her, his expression assessing, calculating, before he finally shook his head and stepped away from the rug, moving instead toward the back room, where Kalen had rested during his recovery. "No thank you," he said. "We're on a schedule. Just need to finish checking your property, and we'll be out of your way." Elira followed him, her mind racing as she noticed the blood-stained bandages she had used during Kalen's treatment, still sitting in a small bin near the back room, evidence she had not yet had time to dispose of properly. If either man noticed them, If they connected the bandages to the man they were hunting, everything would fall apart immediately. "I had a small accident earlier this week," she said quickly, moving to block his direct line of sight to the bin, as best she could without appearing obviously suspicious. "Cut myself pretty badly while chopping wood. Still cleaning up after it, honestly. Hasn't been my most graceful week." The shorter man's eyes flicked toward her hands, checking for visible injury, and finding none. His suspicion visibly sharpened. Illyra's heart nearly stopped, understanding immediately that her improvised excuse had backfired, drawing more attention rather than deflecting it. "Your hands look fine to me," he said slowly, his tone shifting into something colder, more accusatory. "It was my leg, actually," Illyra corrected quickly, forcing a small, embarrassed laugh. "Silly of me to say hands. I'm still a bit rattled from the whole ordeal, if I'm being honest." The tension in the room stretched taut, the shorter man studying her with narrowed eyes, while his taller companion moved to stand beside him, both of them clearly weighing whether her explanations held any truth. Illyra held her breath, praying that her performance had been convincing enough, aware that everything, Kaylin's safety, her own safety, hinged entirely on the next few moments unfolding in her favor. "All right," the taller man finally said, breaking the tense silence. "I think we've seen enough. Sorry again for the intrusion, miss. If you happen to see anything unusual, an injured man, strange activity in the woods, please contact the authorities immediately. This individual is considered dangerous." "Of course," Illyra said, relief flooding through her, though she carefully kept it hidden behind a composed expression. "I hope you find whoever you're looking for." The two men made their way toward the front door, and Illyra followed, her legs feeling unsteady, with the release of tension that had gripped her entire body throughout their search. Just as they reached the threshold, the taller man paused, turning back to face her, with one final question. "One more thing," he said. "That pendant you're wearing, family heirloom?" Illyra's hand instinctively rose to touch the wolf-shaped pendant at her throat, confusion flickering across her face at the unexpected question. "Yes," she said carefully. "My grandmother's. Why do you ask?" The man studied the pendant for a long moment, something calculating passing behind his eyes, before he finally shook his head, offering a tight smile. "No reason. Just an interesting design. Have a good day, miss." The two men departed, making their way back toward their vehicle parked at the edge of her property, and Illyra watched from the window until they had fully disappeared from sight, her body finally allowing itself to shake with the aftermath of the encounter. She waited several more minutes, ensuring they had truly left the area, before rushing to the kitchen and pulling back the rug to release Kaylin from his hiding place. He emerged, looking pale and tense, having heard every tense moment of the conversation through the thin flooring separating them. "Are you all right?" he asked immediately, his hands checking her over, as though searching for any sign of harm, despite knowing logically that the encounter had ended without physical confrontation. "I'm fine," Illyra assured him, though her voice still trembled slightly with residual adrenaline. "That was terrifying, Kaylin. They asked about my pendant, specifically. I don't think that was a coincidence." Kaylin's expression darkened with concern. "They recognized it," he said grimly. "Or at least suspected its significance. That's not good, Illyra. If they've made any connection between you and the wolf bloodlines, it changes everything. It means you're not just someone helping me anymore. You're a target in your own right." The weight of his words settled heavily between them, transforming what had already felt like a dangerous situation into something far more complicated and threatening. Illyra sank into a kitchen chair, processing the implications, while Kaylin paced the small space, his mind working through possibilities and contingencies with the sharp focus of someone who had spent years navigating threats to his own survival and the survival of those under his protection. "We can't stay here," he finally said, stopping his pacing to face her directly. "Not after this. They may return, possibly with more men, possibly with orders to take a much closer look at you, and this property specifically. I need to get you somewhere safer, somewhere I can actually protect you properly." "And where exactly would that be?" Illyra asked, though her tone carried more curiosity than resistance. "You're still recovering. You can barely walk long distances without resting." "My pack territory," Kaylin said after a moment's consideration. "It's dangerous, yes, given the betrayal that led me here in the first place, but it's also the one place where I have loyal allies, People who can help protect both of us, while we figure out the full scope of what we're dealing with. It's a risk, but staying here feels like an even greater one now. Illyra absorbed his words, understanding the gravity of what he was proposing. Leaving her home, the only place she had ever known, to venture into a world of wolves and political conflict that she barely understood, carried enormous uncertainty. But remaining here, having already drawn suspicion from dangerous men who seemed to recognize the significance of her family heirloom, felt equally uncertain, perhaps even more dangerous. "All right," she said finally, meeting his eyes with quiet determination. "If that's what it takes to keep both of us safe, then that's what we'll do. But you need to be honest with me about everything from this point forward, Kaelin. No more half explanations. If I'm walking into your world, I need to understand exactly what I'm walking into." Kaelin nodded, appreciation and respect deepening in his expression, as he studied the woman who continued, again and again, to meet danger with courage rather than retreat. "I promise," he said, "from here forward, complete honesty. You deserve nothing less, especially given everything you've already sacrificed to keep me alive." Outside, the winter sun climbed higher over the frozen landscape, illuminating tire tracks leading away from the cabin, tracks that would soon report back to someone far more dangerous than the two men who had just departed. Someone whose betrayal had started this entire chain of events, and who would not rest until his former Alpha King was permanently eliminated, along with anyone foolish enough to stand in his way. They left within the hour, packing only what could fit into 2 small bags, Illyra taking one final look at the cabin that had been her home for years, before locking the door behind her, uncertain if she would ever return. Kaelin led the way through a route he had chosen carefully, avoiding the main roads, and instead cutting through less traveled forest paths that offered better concealment, even if the terrain proved more challenging for someone still recovering from serious injury. The morning had grown colder, gray clouds gathering overhead, promising more snow before the day's end. Illyra walked close beside Kaelin, watching his pace carefully, noting the way he occasionally paused to steady himself against a tree trunk, his body clearly still far from fully healed, despite the progress made over the past several days. "We should rest soon," she said, concern coloring her voice as she watched him press a hand briefly against his side. "You're pushing yourself too hard." "We don't have the luxury of resting for long," Kaelin replied, though he did not argue against the suggestion entirely. "Those men will report back to whoever sent them. If they suspected anything at all during their search, reinforcements could already be moving toward this area." They continued for another hour, before Kaelin finally allowed them a brief pause near a frozen stream, both of them settling onto a fallen log while he caught his breath, his face paler than it had been that morning. Illyra retrieved water and a small portion of food from her bag, insisting he eat something despite his protests that they needed to keep moving. "Tell me about your pack," she said as he ate, hoping conversation might distract him from the discomfort clearly written across his features. What happened, exactly, that led to all of this? Kaelin was quiet for a long moment, memories clearly weighing heavily on him as he considered how much to share. "I trusted a man named Garrett Thorne," he finally said, his voice carrying a bitterness that had not been present before. "He led the Eastern Pack, always spoke of unity between our territories, of building something stronger together, rather than existing as separate competing forces. I believed him. I invited him and his people to a summit meant to formalize an alliance between our packs. And he betrayed you," Illyra said quietly, understanding already forming in her mind. "The shots came the moment I stepped outside," Kaelin continued, his jaw tightening at the memory. "I don't know for certain that Garrett fired them himself, but the timing, the coordination, it couldn't have happened without his knowledge and approval. He wanted my throne, Illyra. He'd wanted it for years, disguising his ambition behind talk of peace and cooperation. What happens now, if you return to your pack territory?" Illyra asked. "Won't he simply try again, now that he knows you survived?" "Almost certainly," Kaelin admitted grimly. "But I have allies there too, people whose loyalty I trust completely. My beta, Dorian, has served beside me for years. If anyone can help us navigate this safely, it's him. He'll have noticed my absence by now. Will likely already be searching for answers about what happened at the summit." Illyra absorbed this information, piecing together the complicated political landscape Kaelin was inviting her into. A world of shifting loyalties and dangerous ambition that extended far beyond the simple rescue that had brought them together. "This is a lot more complicated than I initially realized," she admitted. "I know," Kaelin said, meeting her eyes with genuine regret. "And I understand. If part of you wishes you had simply called for help that first night, and let someone else deal with all of this. You didn't sign up for any of it." "I don't regret helping you," Elira said firmly, without hesitation. "Complicated or not, dangerous or not, I made my choice that night, and I'm not going to abandon it now, just because the situation has grown more difficult than either of us expected." Kaelin studied her, something warm and grateful settling into his expression despite the exhaustion and pain still evident in his posture. "You continue to surprise me," he said quietly. "Most people, faced with everything you now know, would have found a way to walk away by now." "Maybe I'm not most people," Elira replied, echoing words she had spoken days before, a small smile touching her lips despite the gravity of their situation. "Besides, if what you suspect about my family's bloodline turns out to be true, walking away might not even be an option anymore. Whatever's happening to me, whatever connection I might have to your world, I think it's already begun changing things, whether I fully understand it yet or not." They rested only a short while longer before continuing their journey, the forest growing denser around them as they moved deeper into unfamiliar territory. Elira found herself watching the trees with newfound wariness, aware now that danger could emerge from any direction, that the world she had always considered peaceful and predictable had transformed, seemingly overnight, into something far more perilous and uncertain. As afternoon light began fading toward evening, Kaelin suddenly stopped walking, his body going rigid with alertness that immediately transferred to Elira, her pulse quickening in response to his obvious tension. "What is it?" she whispered. "We're being followed," he said quietly, his eyes scanning the tree line with focused intensity. "Someone's out there. I can feel it." Elira froze beside Kaelin, her breath catching as she scanned the darkening tree line, searching for any sign of the danger he had sensed. The forest had grown quiet around them, unnaturally quiet, the usual sounds of birds and small creatures rustling through underbrush conspicuously absent. She had lived near these woods long enough to recognize the difference between natural silence and the kind that meant something predatory had entered the area. "Stay behind me," Kaelin said quietly, positioning himself between her and the direction he had been watching, though his weakened condition made the protective gesture more symbolic than practically effective. "Whatever happens, don't run. Running triggers instinct in predators, makes you a target faster than standing your ground ever would." Elira nodded, though fear tightened every muscle in her body as she watched shadows shift between the distant trees. Long moments passed in tense silence before a figure finally emerged from the tree line, moving with deliberate, unhurried steps that somehow felt more threatening than if they had rushed toward them directly. The man who approached was tall, dressed in dark clothing similar to the two who had searched Elira's cabin earlier that day, though something about his bearing suggested higher rank, greater confidence. He stopped several paces away, studying Kaelin with an expression that mixed surprise and calculation in equal measure. "Well," the man said, his voice carrying a coldness that made Elira's skin crawl, "I have to admit, I didn't expect to find you still breathing, Alpha King. Garrett will be very interested to hear you survived his little surprise." "Tell Garrett," Kaelin said, his voice steady despite the obvious strain evident in his posture, "that his betrayal will not go unanswered. He'll answer for what he's done, one way or another." The man laughed, a sharp, humorless sound that echoed unpleasantly through the quiet forest. "Bold words for a man who can barely stand upright," he said, his eyes flicking briefly toward Elira before returning to Kaelin. "And who exactly is this? Your little human helper? Didn't take you long to find yourself some assistance, did it?" "She has nothing to do with this," Kaelin said firmly, his tone carrying unmistakable warning despite his weakened state. "Whatever quarrel exists between you and me, it doesn't extend to her." "Doesn't it, though?" the man asked, taking a slow step closer, his eyes narrowing with renewed calculation as he studied Elira more carefully. "Anyone who helps you becomes part of this conflict, whether you like it or not. That's simply how these things work." Elira felt fear coiling tightly in her chest, but she forced herself to remain steady, refusing to let the man see how deeply his words unsettled her. She thought of the wolf pendant resting against her skin, of the strange, undefined potential Kaelin believed might exist within her own blood, and though she had no idea how to access whatever abilities might be dormant inside her, she refused to simply cower in fear before this threat. "You should leave," she said, her voice carrying more steadiness than she felt internally. "Whatever you're planning, it won't end well for you." The man's eyebrows rose slightly at her bold response, something almost amused flickering across his expression. "Confident, for a human," he observed. "Though I suppose confidence matters little against numbers you can't see." As if summoned by his words, 3 more figures emerged from the surrounding trees, positioning themselves to cut off any possible escape route. Illyra's heart pounded as she realized the trap that had been set, understanding immediately that this confrontation had been planned carefully, that they had walked directly into an ambush despite Kaelin's efforts to avoid exactly this outcome. 4 against 1 weakened target, Kaelin said grimly, his eyes scanning the surrounding men with the calculating focus of someone still searching for any possible advantage, despite the obvious disadvantage of the situation. Garrett always did prefer overwhelming odds rather than fair fights. "Why take unnecessary risks?" the lead man replied smoothly, "when overwhelming force guarantees success." Garrett learned that lesson well during his years serving beside you, Alpha King. Perhaps the one useful thing you ever taught him. The tension in the clearing stretched taut, every person present understanding that violence was moments away from erupting. Illyra's mind raced, searching desperately for any option that might improve their chances, any advantage that could shift the balance even slightly in their favor. Her eyes fell on a heavy branch lying nearby, and though the thought of physically fighting trained wolves seemed almost absurd, desperation pushed her toward considering options she would never have entertained under ordinary circumstances. Then, without warning, one of the men lunged toward Kaelin, moving with inhuman speed that Illyra's eyes could barely track. Kaelin reacted instinctively despite his weakened state, twisting aside just enough to avoid the worst of the attack, though the movement clearly cost him dearly, pain flashing across his face as his injured side protested the sudden exertion. Chaos erupted immediately after that first strike, the remaining men converging with coordinated aggression that overwhelmed Kaelin's ability to defend himself effectively. Illyra watched in horror as he fought desperately, landing occasional strikes but taking far more punishment than he delivered, his body simply lacking the strength required to match 4 opponents, even under normal circumstances, let alone while still recovering from serious injury. Something inside Illyra snapped in that moment, a surge of protective fury overriding the fear that had gripped her throughout the confrontation. She grabbed the heavy branch from the ground and rushed forward, swinging it with all the strength she possessed toward the nearest attacker, catching him across the shoulder with enough force to stagger him backward in obvious surprise. The man turned toward her, initial surprise quickly transforming into anger, and Illyra braced herself for retaliation, adrenaline flooding through her system with an intensity she had never experienced before. But as he lunged toward her, something strange happened. Her body moved before conscious thought could direct it, dodging his attack with a speed and precision that felt entirely unfamiliar, as though instinct honed over generations had suddenly activated within her muscles. The man's eyes widened with shock as she evaded his strike easily, his confusion giving her the opening needed to deliver a solid blow that sent him stumbling backward, clutching his jaw with obvious pain. Illyra stared at her own hands, disbelief and adrenaline mixing together, as she processed what had just happened, the impossible speed and strength that had suddenly emerged from somewhere deep within her. "Illyra," Kaelin called out, his voice carrying urgent warning, as another attacker moved toward her, having noticed the unexpected threat she now posed. She turned just in time to brace herself, her body once again responding with reflexes that felt both foreign and instinctively natural, deflecting the incoming strike with a defensive movement she had never been taught but somehow executed perfectly. The lead man, watching this unexpected development with narrowed eyes, called out a sharp command. "Enough. Fall back." The remaining attackers, though clearly reluctant, obeyed immediately, retreating several steps while maintaining wary distance. The lead man studied Illyra with an entirely new expression, calculation replacing his earlier dismissiveness as he processed what he had just witnessed. "Interesting," he said slowly. "It seems the little human isn't quite so human after all. Garrett will find this development extremely interesting indeed." "Leave," Kaelin said, his voice hard despite the exhaustion clearly weighing on him, blood visible now from a fresh wound, sustained during the brief but intense confrontation. You've seen enough for one day. Retreat while you still can. The lead man studied them both for a long moment, weighing options that Alira could not fully interpret, before finally nodding slowly. This isn't over, he said, his tone carrying quiet menace despite his decision to withdraw. We know you're heading toward Pact territory. We'll be watching, waiting for the right moment. Enjoy this small victory while it lasts. With that, the four men melted back into the surrounding forest, disappearing as quickly and quietly as they had first appeared, leaving Kaelin and Alira alone in the clearing, both breathing heavily, both processing the intensity of what had just transpired. Are you hurt? Kaelin asked immediately, moving toward her despite his own visible injuries, concern overriding his own pain as he checked her carefully for any sign of harm. I'm fine, Alira said, though her voice trembled slightly with the aftermath of adrenaline and shock. Kaelin, what just happened? That speed, that strength, I've never done anything like that before in my entire life. Your bloodline, Kaelin said, understanding dawning across his exhausted features, despite the pain still evident in his posture. It's awakening, Alara. Whatever ancient connection exists within your family, danger seems to have triggered it, activated abilities that had remained dormant your entire life, until this exact moment. Alira stared down at her own hands, still trying to process the reality of what her body had just accomplished, the impossible strength and speed that had emerged so naturally despite her complete lack of any training or preparation. I know, Kaelin said gently, reaching out to steady her, as the shock of the confrontation continued settling over both of them. But we don't have time to fully process it right now. They know our destination. We need to move quickly, before Garrett has time to prepare additional forces to intercept us. Despite his own exhaustion and injuries, Kaelin pushed forward with renewed urgency, and Alira matched his pace, her mind still reeling from the discovery of abilities she had never known existed within her, abilities that had potentially just saved both their lives. As they continued deeper into the forest, moving toward the uncertain safety of Pact territory, Alira found herself wondering, with equal parts fear and fascination, exactly how much more remained hidden within her own blood, waiting to be discovered. They walked in tense silence for the next several hours, both of them alert to every sound the forest produced, neither willing to risk conversation that might distract from the vigilance their survival now depended upon. As the last light of day faded into deep twilight, Kaelin finally slowed his pace, gesturing toward a distant ridge where faint lights flickered against the darkening sky. That's the edge of my territory, he said quietly, relief evident in his voice despite the exhaustion clearly weighing on his body. If we can reach those lights, we'll be within reach of my people, within reach of protection I can actually rely on. Alira nodded, though the sight of unfamiliar lights in the distance did little to ease the anxiety that had settled into her chest since the confrontation earlier that day. Everything about her life had changed so dramatically in such a short span of time that the concept of safety felt distant, almost theoretical, despite Kaelin's reassurances. How much farther? She asked, noting the way his steps had begun to falter slightly, his body clearly reaching the limits of what it could endure, despite his determination to continue. Not far, he said, though his voice carried strain that suggested even this shortened distance might prove challenging given his current condition. Perhaps another hour, if we maintain this pace. They continued forward, the terrain growing more familiar to Kaelin, with each passing mile, landmarks he recognized from years of patrolling this territory, offering him renewed confidence, despite his physical exhaustion. Alira followed close behind, her mind still processing the strange new sensations that had awakened within her body during the earlier confrontation, an awareness of her own physical capabilities that felt both exhilarating and deeply unsettling. As they crested a small hill, a sharp whistle cut through the darkness, followed immediately by the sound of rapid footsteps approaching from multiple directions. Alira tensed instinctively, her body once again responding with heightened alertness that she was only beginning to understand, but Kaelin raised a hand, signaling calm despite the approaching figures. Identify yourself, a voice called out sharply from the darkness ahead. It's Kaelin, he called back, his voice carrying authority despite its weakened state. Stand down. A stunned silence followed his declaration before the sound of urgent movement resumed, several figures emerging from the shadows, with expressions of shock and relief mixing together, as recognition dawned. The lead figure, a broad-shouldered man with sharp, alert eyes, rushed forward, disbelief evident across his features. "Kaelin," he breathed, relief flooding his voice. We assumed the worst when you disappeared after the summit. Dorian has had search parties, combing every corner of this territory for days." "Take me to him," Kaelin said, his strength visibly failing now that safety felt within reach, the adrenaline that had sustained him throughout the dangerous journey finally beginning to fade. There's a great deal he needs to know, and very little time to waste before Garrett makes his next move. The guard's eyes shifted toward Elira, curiosity and caution mixing in his expression as he took in the sight of a human woman standing beside his Alpha King, clearly having played some significant role in his survival and return. "And her?" he asked carefully. "She saved my life," Kaelin said simply, though the words carried weight far beyond their simplicity. "Treat her with the same respect and protection you would offer me. That's not a request, Marcus. That's an order." Marcus nodded immediately, though questions clearly lingered behind his eyes. "Understood," he said. "Let's get you both to safety. Dorian will want to see you immediately." As they were escorted deeper into pack territory, lights growing brighter and more numerous around them, Elira felt the weight of everything that had happened over the past several days, finally beginning to settle over her exhausted mind. She had left behind the only home she had ever known, discovered abilities within herself she had never imagined possible, and now found herself walking into a world of politics and danger that extended far beyond anything she could have prepared for. Kaelin glanced toward her as they walked, seeming to sense the overwhelming nature of everything she was processing. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice sincere, despite the exhaustion evident in every word. "For everything. I know none of this is what you expected when you found me bleeding in the snow outside your home. I don't regret any of it," Elira said, meeting his eyes with quiet determination despite her own exhaustion. "Whatever happens next, Kaelin, we'll face it together." He offered her a small, grateful smile, and together, surrounded by guards whose loyalty had just been tested and confirmed, they continued forward into the heart of pack territory, toward answers, toward allies, and toward a confrontation with betrayal that neither of them could yet fully anticipate. The pack stronghold rose before them like something out of an ancient legend, a sprawling estate built from dark stone and timber, nestled deep within the forest, and surrounded by high walls that spoke of both grandeur and defensive necessity. Torches lined the pathway leading toward the main entrance, their flickering light casting long shadows across the snow-covered grounds, and Elira found herself staring in quiet awe despite the exhaustion weighing heavily on her body. Before they could reach the main doors, they burst open, and a tall man with sharp features and dark, intense eyes rushed out into the cold evening air, his expression a mixture of disbelief and overwhelming relief. He crossed the distance between them in seconds, gripping Kaelin's shoulders as though needing physical confirmation that his Alpha King truly stood before him alive. "Kaelin," the man breathed, his voice thick with emotion he was clearly struggling to contain. "We searched everywhere. I feared the worst when you didn't return from the summit, when reports started coming in about gunfire and chaos breaking out. I should have been there. I should have insisted on accompanying you." "Dorian," Kaelin said, gratitude and exhaustion mixing in his voice as he embraced his loyal Beta briefly. "I'm alive because of her." He gestured toward Elira, who stood slightly behind him, feeling suddenly self-conscious under the weight of Dorian's assessing gaze. "This is Elira. She found me after the ambush, treated my wounds, and has continued protecting me throughout this entire journey, despite the danger it placed her in." Dorian's expression shifted, curiosity and something like careful respect, replacing his initial shock as he studied Elira more closely. "Then you have my gratitude," he said, offering her a slight formal bow that caught her off guard. "Whatever you need, whatever protection or resources this pack can offer, they belong to you now." "Thank you," Elira managed, still somewhat overwhelmed by the intensity of the reception and the strange formality of pack customs she was only beginning to understand. Dorian's attention returned to Kaelin, sharpening with renewed urgency, as practical concerns overtook the emotional relief of reunion. "We need to get you both inside immediately," he said. "You're injured, exhausted, and quite possibly still being tracked." I'll have healers waiting, and we need to discuss everything that happened at that summit before we plan our next move. They were led inside quickly, the warmth of the stronghold's interior, a welcome relief after the long, dangerous journey through frozen forest terrain. Illyra found herself surrounded by tapestries depicting wolves in various forms, intricate carvings adorning wooden beams overhead, and the quiet, watchful presence of numerous pack members who paused their activities to observe the unexpected arrival of their Alpha King, alongside an unfamiliar human woman. Kalen was taken immediately to receive proper medical attention, his injuries far more serious than the makeshift treatment Illyra had been able to provide, requiring more thorough care. Illyra, meanwhile, found herself gently guided toward a private sitting room, offered warm tea and food while she waited for further instruction, her mind still reeling from the sheer scope of everything she had witnessed since arriving. She had barely settled into a comfortable chair near a crackling fireplace when the door opened again, revealing an elderly woman with silver hair pulled back in an elegant braid, her eyes sharp and perceptive despite her advanced age. The woman studied Illyra for a long moment before stepping fully into the room, closing the door quietly behind her. "You must be Illyra," the woman said, her voice carrying a warmth that immediately put Illyra somewhat at ease, despite her uncertainty. "I'm Miriam. I serve as elder and healer for this pack, among other responsibilities I've accumulated over many years." "It's nice to meet you," Illyra said, though caution still colored her tone given everything unfamiliar about the situation she found herself navigating. Miriam's eyes drifted toward the wolf pendant resting against Illyra's collarbone, and her expression shifted subtly, sharpening with sudden, intense interest. "May I ask where you acquired that pendant?" she asked, moving closer with unmistakable purpose. "It belonged to my grandmother," Illyra said, her hand instinctively rising to touch the familiar metal. "She passed it down to me before she died." Kalen seemed to think it might be significant, connected somehow to bloodlines that predate normal human history. Miriam's expression grew increasingly focused as she examined the pendant more closely, though she did not touch it directly, seeming to understand instinctively that the item held personal significance beyond simple curiosity. "May I ask your grandmother's name?" she asked quietly. "Adeline," Illyra replied. "Adeline Ward. She lived most of her life in a small village near the northern forest, though she mentioned once that our family originally came from somewhere farther east, generations back." Something flickered across Miriam's face, recognition mixing with surprise, and something almost reverent as she absorbed this information. "Adeline Ward," she repeated softly, as though testing the name against memories long buried. "I believe I may have heard that name before, spoken in old stories passed down through generations of pack elders. Stories about a bloodline of healers who lived among humans, who possessed abilities connected to our kind but chose, for reasons lost to history, to remain separate from formal pack structure." Illyra leaned forward, genuine interest overtaking her earlier caution. "What do you know about them?" she asked. "About my family, I mean, if that's truly what you're describing." Miriam settled into a chair across from Illyra, her expression thoughtful as she gathered her thoughts, clearly weighing how much history to share with someone who had only just discovered the existence of this hidden world. "Centuries ago," she began, "before the current pack structures existed as they do now, there were bloodlines among wolves that specialized in healing, in remedies and abilities that went beyond simple physical strength or transformation. These healer bloodlines were revered, protected, considered essential to the survival of entire communities during times of conflict. But something happened," Illyra guessed, sensing the weight behind Miriam's careful pacing. "War," Miriam said simply, "a conflict between rival pack territories, centuries past, that scattered many of these healer bloodlines, forcing survivors into hiding among human populations to escape persecution and violence. Over generations, many of these bloodlines lost connection to their original heritage entirely, their descendants living entirely human lives, unaware of the abilities that remained dormant within their blood." Illyra absorbed this history with growing fascination, pieces of her own family's mysterious past finally beginning to form a coherent picture. "My grandmother used to say strange things sometimes," she said slowly, memory surfacing details she had long dismissed as simple eccentricity. "She spoke of old blood, of family responsibilities I never understood, of a debt owed to something she called the old packs. I always assumed she meant something metaphorical, nothing literal. It sounds as though your grandmother retained some knowledge of your true heritage, even if incomplete, Miriam said, her expression growing warmer, more genuinely pleased by this discovery. If you are indeed descended from the healer bloodlines I'm describing, it would explain a great deal, Alira. The effectiveness of remedies you learned from her, the way your body seems to have responded during whatever confrontation occurred on your journey here, based on what young Marcus reported when he brought word of your arrival. I displayed some kind of strength and speed I've never experienced before, Alira confirmed, still somewhat disbelieving, despite having lived through the experience herself. It happened so naturally, almost like instinct taking over, but I have no idea how to control it or understand what exactly triggered it. Dormant bloodlines often awaken under extreme stress or danger, Miriam explained. The body recognizes threat and calls upon abilities that have remained hidden, sometimes for generations, waiting for exactly the right circumstances to finally emerge. It would explain everything perfectly, and if my suspicions are correct, it would mean something even more significant for both you and for Kaelin. What do you mean? Alira asked, curiosity mixing with growing apprehension. Miriam's expression grew serious. Weighted with implications, she seemed almost reluctant to voice directly. Healer bloodlines, historically, held special significance within pack structures, particularly for those who held positions of leadership. An alpha bonded to a healer carried protection and strength that other bonds simply could not replicate. If you are truly descended from this bloodline, your connection to Kaelin, however it began, however unlikely the circumstances of your meeting, may carry significance far beyond simple gratitude for having saved his life. Alira felt her cheeks warm slightly at the implication behind Miriam's words, uncertain how to process the suggestion that her bond with Kaelin might carry deeper significance within this world she was only beginning to understand. I'm not sure what to make of that, she admitted honestly. You don't need to make anything of it right now, Miriam said gently, offering a reassuring smile, despite the weight of everything she had just revealed. These things unfold in their own time, Alira. For now, focus on understanding your own abilities, on recovering from the exhausting journey that brought you here, and on supporting Kaelin as he navigates the political challenges awaiting him, now that word of his survival will inevitably spread. As if summoned by the mention of his name, the door opened once more, and Kaelin entered, his wounds now properly treated and bandaged, though exhaustion remained evident in every line of his posture. His eyes found Alira immediately, warmth and relief crossing his features at the sight of her safe, and settled within the stronghold's walls. Miriam, he said, acknowledging the elder with a respectful nod, before crossing the room to sit beside Alira. I see you've already begun getting acquainted. We have, Miriam confirmed, rising from her seat with the fluid grace that belied her advanced age, and I believe we've uncovered information that will prove significant for both of you moving forward. I'll leave you to rest and process everything for now, but Kaelin, we need to speak soon about the healer bloodlines and what Alira's heritage might mean for the challenges ahead. As Miriam departed, closing the door quietly behind her, Kaelin turned toward Alira, curiosity evident in his expression. What did she tell you? He asked. Alira spent the next several minutes recounting everything Miriam had shared, watching as Kaelin's expression shifted through surprise, understanding, and finally something warmer, more contemplative, as he absorbed the full weight of what her heritage might mean, not just for her own future, but for the uncertain path that lay ahead of them both. This changes things, he said finally, though his tone carried none of the alarm Alira might have expected. Not the danger we're facing, that remains just as serious as before, but knowing what you truly are, understanding the significance of the bond that's formed between us during these past several days. It adds weight to everything, Alira. Weight I intend to honor properly, once we've dealt with the more immediate threats surrounding us. Alira met his eyes, warmth and uncertainty mixing together, as she considered everything that had unfolded since that first desperate night when she had found him bleeding in the snow. One thing at a time, she said softly, though a small smile touched her lips despite the gravity of their situation. Let's survive Garrett Thorne first. We can figure out everything else after that. Kaelin nodded, though the look in his eyes suggested he had already begun considering a future far beyond simple survival, a future that included the remarkable woman who had saved his life, and, in doing so, uncovered a heritage neither of them could have anticipated when their paths first collided in that frozen forest clearing. Later that evening, after Alira had been given time to rest and change into warmer clothing provided by the pack's household staff, Dorian requested a meeting to discuss the details of what had happened at the summit and the strategic implications of Kalen's survival becoming known. The gathering took place in a large study lined with old books and detailed maps of the surrounding territories. Several senior pack members present alongside Kalen, Dorian, and, at Kalen's insistence, Alira herself. "Tell me everything you remember," Dorian said, settling into a chair across from Kalen, his expression grave and focused. "Every detail matters now, especially anything that might confirm Garrett's direct involvement, rather than simply circumstantial suspicion." Kalen recounted the events of that night carefully, describing the peaceful atmosphere of the summit before violence erupted, the positioning of the shooters, the coordinated nature of the attack that suggested extensive planning rather than spontaneous aggression. Dorian listened intently, occasionally exchanging glances with the other senior pack members present, their expressions growing increasingly grim as the picture assembled itself with damning clarity. "This matches reports we've gathered independently," Dorian said once Kalen finished speaking. "Several of Garrett's closest advisors have been unusually absent from public gatherings since the summit, and there have been whispers among informants about unusual shipments moving through Eastern Territory in recent weeks. Weapons, potentially, though we haven't confirmed the specifics yet." "Silver," Kalen said grimly. "The bullets used against me were silver. That requires significant resources and planning to acquire in the quantities necessary for an ambush like the one I survived. Which means this wasn't a spontaneous decision," one of the senior pack members added, a woman with graying hair and sharp, calculating eyes, who had been introduced earlier as the head of pack intelligence. "Garrett has been planning this for some time, likely for months, waiting for the right opportunity to eliminate you and claim your territory." The conversation continued for over an hour. Strategies discussed and dismissed, information shared and analyzed from multiple angles. Alira listened carefully, absorbing the complex political dynamics at play, gradually understanding the scope of the danger Kalen faced, not just from the immediate threat of assassination, but from the broader challenge of maintaining leadership and legitimacy, once word of the betrayal became widely known throughout pack territories. "What about her?" the intelligence head finally asked, her eyes turning toward Alira with obvious curiosity. "Miriam mentioned something about a healer bloodline discovery. How does this factor into our strategic considerations?" "Alira's involvement remains her choice," Kalen said firmly, protective instinct evident in his tone, despite the exhaustion still lingering from his ordeal. "She's already done more than enough, saving my life and helping me reach safety, despite enormous personal risk. Whatever role she chooses to play moving forward, that decision belongs entirely to her." "I want to help," Alira said, surprising herself slightly with the certainty in her own voice. "I don't fully understand this world yet, and I have a great deal to learn. But I'm not interested in simply hiding away while all of you face danger on my behalf. If my bloodline can offer something useful, training, abilities, anything at all, I want to develop it properly." Dorian studied her for a long moment, something like respect crossing his sharp features. "Miriam can begin working with you," he said finally. "Healer bloodlines require careful training to access their full potential safely. It won't be easy, and it certainly won't happen overnight. But if you're serious about this commitment, we can absolutely provide the guidance you'll need." The meeting continued late into the evening, strategies solidifying around gathering additional evidence of Garrett's betrayal, strengthening defensive positions throughout pack territory, and preparing for the near certainty that Garrett would attempt another move once he learned definitively that Kalen had survived and returned to his stronghold. By the time the discussion finally concluded, exhaustion had settled deeply into everyone present, the weight of the challenges ahead pressing heavily against the relief of having reached temporary safety. As pack members began dispersing to their various responsibilities, Dorian pulled Kalen aside briefly, his expression carrying something more personal beneath the professional concern of their earlier strategic discussion. "I'm glad you're alive," he said quietly, gripping his Alpha King's shoulder firmly. "I don't know what I would have done if Garrett had succeeded. This pack, this territory, it needs you, Kalen, more than you probably realize." "I know," Kalen said, gratitude evident in his tired voice. "And I couldn't have made it back here without Alira. Whatever happens moving forward, I need you to understand how much I trust her, Dorian. Not just because of what she's done for me, but because of who she's proven herself to be throughout this entire ordeal. Dorian glanced toward where Elira stood, speaking quietly with Miriam near the study's entrance, something thoughtful crossing his expression. I understand, he said simply, though the weight behind his words suggested he understood more than his brief response conveyed. Later that night, as the stronghold settled into quiet stillness, Elira found herself standing near a window, overlooking the moonlit forest surrounding Pack territory, her mind still processing the overwhelming events of recent days. Footsteps approached quietly behind her, and she did not need to turn to know Kalen had joined her, his presence somehow already familiar despite the short time they had known each other. Difficult day, he said softly, coming to stand beside her. Difficult week, Elira corrected, a tired smile touching her lips, despite the exhaustion weighing on her. I keep waiting to wake up and discover this was all some elaborate dream, but every time I check, it remains stubbornly real. Kalen chuckled quietly, though his expression soon grew more serious as he studied her carefully. Do you regret it? He asked. Any of it? Finding me that night, everything that's happened since? Elira considered the question seriously, turning to meet his eyes directly. No, she said finally, certainty evident in her voice. Frightening, yes. Overwhelming, absolutely. But not something I regret, Kalen. Not for a moment. Something in his expression softened at her answer. Warmth and gratitude mixing with an emotion neither of them was quite ready to name directly. Whatever happens with Garrett, he said quietly. Whatever challenges lie ahead, I promise you this. I will do everything within my power to keep you safe, and to make certain you never regret the choice you made that night. Elira nodded, comfortable silence settling between them as they both turned to watch the moonlit forest beyond the stronghold walls, unaware that somewhere in that same darkness, informants loyal to Garrett Thorne had already confirmed Kalen's survival. Information that would soon reach their treacherous leader and set into motion the next dangerous phase of a conflict that had only just begun. 2 weeks passed within the safety of the stronghold, and during that time, Elira found herself immersed in a world unlike anything she could have imagined even a month earlier. Miriam took her education seriously, beginning each morning with lessons about the history of healer bloodlines, their traditional role within Pack society, and the delicate balance required to access dormant abilities without losing control over them entirely. Your abilities responded to danger before, Miriam explained one crisp morning, as they walked together through a private training area located within the stronghold's walls. Instinct guided you then, but instinct alone will only carry you so far. True mastery requires understanding, discipline, and consistent practice. Where do we even begin? Elira asked, genuine uncertainty evident in her voice, despite the determination that had brought her to this point. With meditation, Miriam said, gesturing toward a quiet corner of the training area where soft cushions had been arranged near a small, carefully tended garden. Before you can control physical abilities, you must first understand the source from which they originate. Sit, close your eyes, and simply breathe. Let your awareness extend inward, toward whatever dormant strength exists within your blood. The process felt strange and uncertain at first, Elira struggling to quiet her racing thoughts long enough to focus on the exercise Miriam had described. But over subsequent days, something gradually began shifting within her, a subtle awareness growing clearer each time she practiced, until she could sense, faintly but unmistakably, a warmth pulsing somewhere deep within her chest that felt distinctly different from ordinary human sensation. There, Miriam said approvingly, during one particularly successful session, watching as Elira's expression shifted with quiet recognition. You found it. That warmth, that awareness. That's your connection to the bloodline running through your veins. Everything else builds from that foundation. Alongside her training with Miriam, Elira also spent considerable time with Kalen, their bond deepening naturally as they navigated the challenges of Pack life together. He showed her the stronghold's grounds, introduced her to loyal Pack members whose respect she gradually earned through her evident courage and genuine desire to understand their world, and slowly, carefully, allowed himself to open up about aspects of his life and leadership that extended far beyond the crisis currently consuming his attention. "I never expected any of this," he admitted one evening as they walked together along the stronghold's outer wall, the setting sun painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. Becoming Alpha King came with enormous responsibility, and for years, I told myself that responsibility left no room for personal connections beyond duty and loyalty to my pack. "And now?" Illyra asked, curious, despite the vulnerability evident in his admission. "Now," Kaelin said, turning to face her directly, warmth evident in his expression despite the seriousness underlying his words. "I'm beginning to understand that some connections strengthen leadership rather than distracting from it. You've shown more courage and loyalty in the short time I've known you than many who have served this pack for years. That's not something I take lightly." Illyra felt warmth spreading through her chest at his words, an emotion she was only beginning to fully acknowledge, despite having felt its presence growing steadily since that first desperate night in the snow. "I feel it too," she admitted quietly. "Whatever this is between us, it feels like more than simple gratitude or circumstance." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps, and both turned to find Dorian approaching with visible urgency, his expression carrying news that immediately shattered the peaceful moment they had been sharing. "Kaelin," he said, slightly breathless from having crossed the grounds quickly, "we've received confirmation. Garrett knows you survived. Our informants report increased activity throughout his territory, gatherings of armed forces, preparations that suggest he's planning something significant, and soon." Kaelin's expression hardened immediately, the warmth that had characterized his earlier conversation with Illyra, replaced by the focused intensity of leadership facing genuine threat. "How soon?" he asked. "Difficult to say with certainty," Dorian admitted, "but based on the scale of preparation we're observing, I'd estimate we have perhaps 2 weeks before he makes his move, possibly less. We need to accelerate our own preparations accordingly." "What kind of move are we expecting?" Illyra asked, her training with Miriam having given her enough confidence to insert herself directly into strategic discussions that would have felt entirely foreign only weeks earlier. "Uncertain," Dorian admitted, though his expression suggested he had already considered multiple possibilities. "Direct assault seems unlikely given our defensive advantages here. More probable would be attempts to undermine Kaelin's political standing among allied packs, painting him as unstable or unfit for leadership following his prolonged absence, while simultaneously working to eliminate remaining loyal supporters through more subtle means." Kaelin nodded grimly, already turning his thoughts toward the complex political maneuvering that leadership required, even amid the immediate physical danger Garrett's forces represented. "We need to move quickly," he said. "Gather the senior council. It's time we began planning our response in earnest, rather than simply reacting to whatever Garrett chooses to throw at us next." As Dorian departed to arrange the requested meeting, Kaelin turned back toward Illyra, regret evident in his expression at having their private moment interrupted by such urgent concerns. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I wish we had more time before all of this demanded our full attention again." "Don't apologize," Illyra said firmly, meeting his eyes with quiet resolve despite the fear that inevitably accompanied news of Garrett's mounting threat. "This is exactly why I've been training so hard, Kaelin. Whatever comes next, I want to stand beside you, not hide away while you face it alone." Something in his expression shifted, gratitude and admiration mixing together as he studied her carefully. "You continue to prove yourself remarkable," he said softly. "Whatever challenges lie ahead, I'm grateful, more than I can properly express, that I don't have to face them without you." They returned to the stronghold together, the peaceful moment they had shared now overshadowed by the pressing reality of Garrett's approaching threat. But something had solidified between them during that brief exchange, a bond that felt increasingly unshakable despite the danger surrounding them. As the senior council gathered that evening to begin formulating strategy, Illyra took her place among them without hesitation, no longer simply a human woman who had stumbled into extraordinary circumstances, but a capable participant whose training and growing understanding of her own heritage had earned her rightful place within this complex and dangerous world. Over the following days, preparations intensified throughout the stronghold. Defensive positions were reinforced, alliances with neighboring packs carefully cultivated through diplomatic outreach, and evidence of Garrett's betrayal gathered and organized in preparation for the moment when it would need to be presented, before the broader pack community. Illyra continued her training with Miriam, her control over her awakened abilities growing steadily more refined with each passing day, though both women understood that true testing would only come once actual conflict arrived. One evening, as Illyra practiced alone in the training area, pushing herself through exercises Miriam had assigned to strengthen the connection between mind and awakened instinct, she sensed, rather than heard, someone approaching from behind. She turned quickly, years of newly developed reflexes guiding her movement, only to find Kaelin watching her with an expression of quiet admiration. "You've improved remarkably," he said, stepping closer. "Miriam mentioned your progress has exceeded her expectations." "I have good motivation," Illyra replied, slightly breathless from her exertions. "Knowing what's coming tends to sharpen focus considerably." Kaelin studied her for a long moment, something serious settling into his expression despite the warmth that remained evident beneath it. "Illyra, I need to ask you something important. Once this conflict with Garrett concludes, whatever the outcome, I want you to understand that my feelings for you extend far beyond gratitude or simple attraction. I believe, and Miriam agrees, that what exists between us carries the markings of something the old traditions call a true bond, a connection between alpha and healer that occurs only rarely, and only under circumstances of genuine, deep compatibility." Illyra's heart raced at his words, understanding the significance of what he was suggesting, even without fully grasping every nuance of pack tradition surrounding such bonds. "What does that mean exactly?" she asked softly. "It means," Kaelin said, closing the remaining distance between them, "that I'm falling in love with you, Illyra. Not simply because you saved my life, though I'll always be grateful for that, but because of who you've proven yourself to be throughout everything that's followed. Your courage, your determination, your willingness to embrace a world entirely foreign to everything you knew before. I want to build a future with you, once we've navigated the danger currently threatening everything we care about." Illyra felt tears gathering unexpectedly at his heartfelt declaration, emotion overwhelming her as she processed the depth of feeling evident in his words. "I feel it too," she admitted, her voice thick with emotion. "I think I've felt it since that first night, watching you fight to survive, despite everything working against you. I just didn't have words for it yet." Kaelin reached out, gently cupping her face in his hands, and for a moment, the looming threat of Garrett's betrayal, the political complexities surrounding pack leadership, and every danger still awaiting them, faded into insignificance, replaced entirely by the quiet, powerful connection blooming between two people who had found each other under the most unlikely and dangerous of circumstances. "Whatever happens next," he said softly, "know that what's growing between us, it's real, Illyra, and it's worth fighting for, alongside everything else we're preparing to defend." Their quiet moment together was interrupted once again, this time by Miriam, who approached the training area with unusual urgency evident in her normally composed expression. Both Kaelin and Illyra turned toward her immediately, sensing that whatever news she carried demanded their full attention. "Forgive the interruption," Miriam said, though her tone made clear the interruption was necessary, rather than merely inconvenient. "But something troubling has come to my attention. During routine examination of pack correspondence, I discovered evidence suggesting someone within our own walls may have been passing information to Garrett's forces." The warmth that had filled the training area moments before evaporated instantly, replaced by the cold reality of betrayal, potentially existing far closer than either Kaelin or Illyra had anticipated. "A spy," Kaelin said grimly, his expression hardening into the focused intensity of leadership confronting genuine crisis. "Within my own pack." "Are you certain, Miriam?" "Not entirely certain, no," Miriam admitted. "But the pattern of information leaked, particularly regarding your intended route back toward the stronghold following your escape from the ambush, suggests someone with detailed knowledge of your movements shared that information with parties who should never have possessed it." Illyra felt a chill settle over her despite the relative warmth of the evening, memories of the ambush they had barely survived during their journey resurfacing with unsettling clarity. "That would explain how they knew exactly where to intercept us," she said quietly. "We took a route that should have been nearly impossible to predict, yet they were waiting almost precisely where we happened to be traveling." "Precisely my concern," Miriam confirmed, her expression grave. "I've begun a careful, discreet investigation, but I wanted you both informed immediately. Trust within these walls can no longer be assumed as completely as it once was. At least not until we identify the source of this leak. Kalen's jaw tightened with barely controlled anger at the implications of Miriam's discovery. Betrayal from external enemies difficult enough to navigate, without the added complexity of potential treachery hiding among those who had sworn loyalty to his leadership. "Keep me informed of anything you discover," he said. "And Miriam, exercise extreme caution. If someone within these walls is willing to betray this pact to Garrett, they may not hesitate to act against anyone who threatens to expose them." "I understand," Miriam said, nodding solemnly before departing to continue her careful investigation, leaving Kalen and Alira alone once more, though the peaceful atmosphere of moments before had been thoroughly replaced by renewed tension and uncertainty. "This changes things," Alira said quietly, watching Kalen's expression as he processed the disturbing revelation. "If there's a traitor here too, someone we might see every day, trust with our safety, that's—" She trailed off, unable to fully articulate the unsettling nature of the discovery. "It's exactly the kind of tactic Garrett would employ," Kalen said grimly. "He's always understood that direct confrontation carries risk, that patient manipulation and betrayal from within often achieve results that brute force alone cannot guarantee. I should have anticipated this possibility sooner." "You can't blame yourself for trusting the people who serve you," Alira said firmly, reaching out to place a reassuring hand against his arm. "Betrayal like this, it's not a failure of your leadership, Kalen. It's simply the reality of navigating a world where ambition sometimes outweighs loyalty." He nodded, though tension remained evident in his posture despite her reassurance. "We'll find whoever is responsible," he said with quiet determination, "and when we do, they'll answer for every life their betrayal has endangered." The evening that had begun with such tender vulnerability now settled into watchful vigilance, both of them acutely aware that the danger surrounding them had grown more complex, more insidious than the straightforward external threat they had originally prepared to face. As they made their way back toward the main stronghold, walking closely together despite the weight of Miriam's troubling news, neither could shake the unsettling awareness that somewhere within these very walls, someone they likely knew, perhaps someone they had already trusted with details of their survival, remained loyal, not to Kalen's leadership, but to the ambitions of the man who had already tried once to end his life, and who would surely not hesitate to try again, given the opportunity that inside information could provide. 3 days after Miriam's unsettling discovery, the stronghold buzzed with quiet, controlled tension as the investigation into the suspected traitor continued beneath a careful veil of normalcy. Kalen had insisted that daily routines continue uninterrupted, unwilling to alert whoever had betrayed pack loyalty that their treachery had been detected, preferring instead to identify them through patient, methodical investigation, rather than risking premature exposure that might allow the traitor to escape, or worse, cause additional damage before being caught. Alira found the enforced normalcy almost unbearable, her newly heightened senses making her acutely aware of every subtle shift in behavior among pack members she encountered throughout each day. She had taken to observing gatherings and conversations with careful attention, though she understood that her inexperience made her unlikely to notice details that trained pack members might overlook entirely. "You're distracted," Miriam observed during one of their training sessions, watching as Alira's concentration faltered during an exercise meant to strengthen her control over the strength that had first emerged during the forest ambush. "Your mind isn't fully present." "How can it be?" Alira replied, frustration evident in her voice, "when someone here might be reporting our every move to Garrett. I keep wondering if the person passing us in the hallway, or serving our meals, might be the very same traitor we're trying to identify." "A reasonable concern," Miriam acknowledged, "but one that will only hinder your progress if you allow it to consume your focus entirely. Trust that Dorian and his most reliable investigators are working diligently to identify the source of this leak. Your energy is better spent continuing to strengthen your own abilities, which will prove essential regardless of how this particular situation resolves." Alira nodded, forcing herself to refocus on her training, though the underlying anxiety remained present throughout the remainder of their session. As the day progressed, however, developments finally began emerging that would shift the entire trajectory of the growing crisis. Dorian found Kalen and Alira together that evening, his expression carrying the particular intensity that had come to signal significant news since the investigation began. "We've identified him," he said without preamble, closing the door of the private study behind him to ensure their conversation remained confidential. "Finn, one of the junior guards who joined the pack roughly 8 months ago." Miriam's investigation traced several suspicious communications back to correspondence he'd been sending under the guise of routine supply requests. Kaylin's expression darkened considerably at the revelation. "Finn," he repeated, clearly searching his memory for details about the young guard in question. "I remember him joining. He came recommended by one of our allied packs, if I recall correctly." "That recommendation appears to have been fabricated," Dorian confirmed grimly. "We believe Garrett planted him here months ago, anticipating exactly this kind of situation might eventually prove useful. Patient, methodical infiltration, precisely the kind of long-term strategy Garrett has always favored." "Where is he now?" Kaylin asked, his voice carrying barely controlled anger at the extended betrayal that had apparently been unfolding beneath his notice for the better part of a year. "Under discreet surveillance," Dorian said. "We haven't confronted him directly yet, wanting your input on how best to proceed. We could arrest him immediately, though that risks alerting Garrett that his informant has been discovered, before we can extract useful information about his broader plans. Alternatively, we could feed him false information, using his continued unwitting cooperation to our own advantage." Elira listened carefully to the strategic discussion unfolding between the two men, her mind working through the implications of each potential approach. "What if we did both?" she suggested, drawing surprised glances from both Kaylin and Dorian. "Feed him false information first, buying time to prepare our own defenses based on whatever response that false information provokes from Garrett, then arrest him once we've extracted whatever value we can from the situation." Dorian considered her suggestion thoughtfully, respect evident in his expression despite the seriousness of the circumstances. "That's actually a sound strategy," he said. "Risky, certainly, but potentially far more valuable than simply removing the threat immediately, without gathering additional intelligence first." Kaylin nodded slowly, weighing the approach carefully, before finally reaching a decision. "Do it," he said. "But monitor him closely, Dorian. If there's any indication he suspects we've discovered his betrayal, arrest him immediately, rather than risking further compromise to our security." Over the following days, carefully constructed false information began circulating through channels that Finn had access to. Details suggesting Kaylin intended to travel to a neighboring pack territory for diplomatic negotiations. Information designed specifically to test whether Garrett would attempt another ambush based on intelligence provided by his hidden informant. The pack's actual defenses, meanwhile, were quietly reinforced around the stronghold itself, preparing for the strong possibility that Garrett might instead choose to launch a direct assault once he believed Kaylin had left the relative safety of his fortified territory. The tension throughout the stronghold grew palpable, as everyone aware of the unfolding strategy waited to see how Garrett would respond to the deliberately planted misinformation. Elira found herself unable to fully relax during this period, her training with Miriam intensifying alongside the growing anticipation of confrontation that seemed increasingly inevitable, regardless of which specific tactical approach Garrett ultimately chose to pursue. 4 days after the false information began circulating, Dorian's scouts reported unusual movement along the border separating pack territories, forces mobilizing in numbers that suggested Garrett had indeed taken the bait, believing Kaylin vulnerable during supposed travel to diplomatic negotiations that did not actually exist. But rather than moving toward the fabricated meeting location, the scouts reported something far more alarming. "They're moving toward us," Dorian reported during an emergency council meeting called late that evening, his expression grim as he laid out reconnaissance findings across the study's central table. "Not toward the false destination we provided. Garrett's forces are converging directly on the stronghold itself." "He saw through the deception," Kaylin said, understanding dawning with troubling clarity. "Or perhaps he never fully trusted the information from the start, using it instead to confirm his suspicion that we'd identified his informant and were feeding false intelligence deliberately." "Either way," the intelligence head interjected, her expression equally grave, "we need to prepare for a direct assault, and soon. Based on the numbers our scouts have observed, Garrett has assembled a force significantly larger than what defended the stronghold during previous conflicts." The room fell into tense, focused silence as everyone present processed the severity of the approaching threat. Illyra felt her pulse quickening, the reality of impending violence settling over her with weight that no amount of training could fully prepare her to face, without genuine apprehension. "How long do we have?" Kalen asked, his voice steady, despite the gravity of the situation unfolding before them. "Difficult to say precisely," Dorian admitted, "but based on their current pace and distance from our position, I would estimate 2 days at most, possibly as little as 1, if they push their forces harder than typical travel patterns would suggest." Kalen's expression hardened into the focused determination Illyra had come to associate with his leadership during genuine crisis. "Then we prepare accordingly," he said. "Dorian, coordinate with our defensive forces immediately. Reinforce every vulnerable position throughout the stronghold's perimeter. We need every advantage we can muster before Garrett's forces arrive." As the council meeting dissolved into urgent preparation, various pack members departing to fulfill their assigned responsibilities, Illyra found herself standing beside Kalen, both of them absorbing the weight of what was rapidly approaching. "What about Finn?" she asked quietly. "The traitor. Now that Garrett's true intentions have been confirmed, what happens to him?" "He'll be arrested immediately," Kalen said. "We can't risk him providing any further information during the critical hours ahead, and honestly, his continued presence within these walls poses too significant a threat given what's coming." Dorian returned within the hour, confirming that Finn had been apprehended without incident, his expression carrying grim satisfaction, despite the larger crisis still looming before them. "He's secured," Dorian reported. "Though I suspect the intelligence he's already provided over these past months has given Garrett more than enough information to plan this assault effectively, regardless of anything we might extract from him now." The following hours blurred into intense, focused preparation, every member of the stronghold contributing to defensive efforts in whatever capacity their skills allowed. Illyra worked alongside Miriam, helping prepare medical supplies and remedies that would undoubtedly prove necessary once conflict erupted, while simultaneously continuing to practice controlling her own abilities, understanding that she would likely need to rely on them directly within the coming days. That evening, as preparations continued around them, Kalen found a brief moment to speak privately with Illyra, pulling her aside into a quiet alcove, away from the organized chaos of defensive preparation surrounding the main stronghold. His expression carried a seriousness that immediately captured her full attention. "Illyra," he said, taking her hands in his own, "I need you to understand something important. When Garrett's forces arrive, the fighting will be dangerous, unpredictable, and I cannot guarantee your safety, despite everything we've prepared. I want you to consider remaining in the secured inner chambers during the conflict, protected by our most trusted guards, rather than participating directly in the defense." Illyra felt a flash of protest immediately, though she forced herself to consider his words carefully before responding. "I understand your concern," she said finally, "and I appreciate that it comes from love, rather than doubt in my abilities. But Kalen, I've trained specifically for this possibility. Hiding away while everyone else fights to protect this pack, protect you, that's not something I can accept, especially not now that I understand what I'm capable of contributing." "I feared you would say that," Kalen admitted, a mixture of pride and worry evident in his expression. "But please, promise me you'll be careful. Whatever happens during this conflict, I cannot bear the thought of losing you, not after everything we've already survived together." "I promise," Illyra said softly, reaching up to touch his face gently. "But that same promise applies to you as well, Kalen. Whatever happens, we face it together, and we both make it through to whatever future awaits us afterward." He nodded, pulling her into a brief, tight embrace that conveyed everything words alone could not fully express. The weight of impending danger mixing with the depth of feeling that had grown between them since that first desperate night when their paths had unexpectedly collided. As they finally separated, both returning their attention to the urgent preparations still required before Garrett's forces arrived, neither could fully shake the awareness that the coming days would test everything they had built together, their bond, their courage, and their willingness to fight for a future that suddenly felt more precious and more uncertain than either had fully appreciated before this moment. Night fell over the stronghold, though little rest came to anyone within its walls, despite the exhaustion accumulating from days of intense preparation. Torches burned along the perimeter walls, illuminating teams of guards reinforcing weak points in the defensive structure, while others prepared stockpiles of supplies that would prove essential should the coming conflict stretch beyond a single confrontation. Illyra found herself unable to sleep, her mind cycling endlessly through possibilities, fears, and the strange, undeniable calm that had settled over her despite the danger rapidly approaching. She made her way to the training area, finding it empty at this late hour, and began practicing quietly beneath the moonlight, working through the exercises Miriam had taught her, until her muscles ached with familiar exertion. "You should be resting," a voice said from the entrance, and Illyra turned to find Miriam watching her with knowing eyes, understanding evident in her expression, despite the gentle admonishment in her words. "I can't," Illyra admitted, lowering her arms and turning fully toward the elder healer. "Every time I close my eyes, I think about what's coming, about everyone who might be hurt, and rest feels impossible." Miriam approached slowly, settling onto one of the cushions near the garden, with the deliberate patience of someone who had witnessed countless nights like this one throughout her long life. "Fear before conflict is natural," she said. "Even the most experienced warriors feel it. What matters is how you channel that fear, whether you allow it to paralyze you or use it to sharpen your focus when the moment for action finally arrives." "How do you do it?" Illyra asked, sitting down across from her. "After everything you've witnessed over the years, how do you find peace before something like this?" "I remind myself of what I'm fighting to protect," Miriam said simply. "Not abstract concepts like territory or political power, but specific people, specific bonds that matter more than any fear I might feel individually. You have that same anchor now, Illyra. Kaelin, this pack, the future you're beginning to build here. Let that be your focus, rather than the uncertainty of what tomorrow might bring." Illyra absorbed the elder's words, finding genuine comfort in their wisdom, despite the anxiety that continued lingering beneath the surface. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for everything you've taught me these past weeks. I don't think I could face what's coming without the training you've provided." "You've proven yourself a remarkably quick study," Miriam said, warmth evident in her voice despite the seriousness of their surroundings. "Whatever happens tomorrow, know that you've already exceeded every expectation I held when we first began your training. Your grandmother would be proud, Illyra, of the woman you've become." The mention of her grandmother brought unexpected tears to Illyra's eyes, grief and gratitude mixing together as she considered how far her journey had carried her from the quiet, isolated life she had once known. "I wish she could have told me more, before she passed," Illyra said softly. "About all of this, about who we truly were. Perhaps she believed you would discover it in your own time, when you were truly ready," Miriam suggested gently. "Some truths cannot simply be told, they must be lived, experienced, earned through trial and growth. You've earned this heritage, Illyra, through everything you've faced and overcome these past several weeks." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while longer, before Miriam finally rose, offering Illyra a reassuring smile, before departing to continue her own preparations for the coming conflict. Alone again, Illyra remained in the quiet training area, drawing strength from the elder's words, gradually feeling the anxious tension in her chest ease into something closer to focused determination. Dawn arrived far too quickly, gray light spreading across the stronghold, as final preparations were completed throughout the grounds. Kaelin gathered his senior commanders and closest allies, including Illyra, for one final strategic briefing, before Garrett's forces were expected to arrive, based on the scouts' latest reports. "They're approaching from the eastern ridge," Dorian reported, indicating the position on a detailed map spread across the council table. "Our scouts estimate their forces will reach visual range within the next several hours, likely launching their assault shortly after nightfall, to maximize whatever tactical advantage darkness might provide them." "Then we ensure they find no advantage at all," Kaelin said firmly, his gaze sweeping across the assembled commanders, with the steady confidence of experienced leadership. "Every position has been reinforced. Every contingency we could reasonably anticipate has been prepared for. Whatever Garrett believes he's bringing against us, we will meet it with everything this pack has to offer." The briefing continued for another hour, final details confirmed and adjusted, before the gathering finally dispersed, each commander returning to oversee their designated defensive positions. Illyra remained with Kaelin and Dorian a moment longer, absorbing the weight of what was rapidly approaching. "Are you ready for this?" Kaelin asked quietly, studying her expression carefully. "As ready as I'll ever be," Illyra replied, meeting his eyes with steady determination, despite the fear that remained present beneath her calm exterior. "Whatever happens today, Kaelin, I'm grateful for everything these past weeks have taught me. Whatever comes next, we face it together." He nodded, pulling her into a brief embrace, before duty called him away to oversee final preparations throughout the stronghold. As the day progressed toward evening, tension throughout the grounds grew increasingly palpable, every pack member aware that the confrontation determining their future, and the future of the entire Northern Pack's territory, was rapidly approaching with each passing hour. As the sun began sinking below the western horizon, casting long shadows across the fortified grounds, a horn sounded from the eastern watchtower, its urgent, sustained note carrying clearly across the entire stronghold. Illyra's heart pounded as she recognized the signal immediately, understanding, without needing confirmation, that Garrett's forces had finally arrived, and that the conflict determining everything they had fought and prepared for was about to begin. The horn's echo had barely faded before the stronghold erupted into coordinated, purposeful motion, every pack member rushing to their assigned defensive positions with the practiced efficiency of preparation finally being put to use. Illyra found herself positioned near the medical station Miriam had established within the inner courtyard, though her role, she understood clearly, would extend far beyond simply tending to wounded fighters once the conflict truly began. From her vantage point, she could see the eastern ridge where Garrett's forces had begun emerging from the tree line, their numbers even more substantial than the scouts' earlier reports had suggested. Torches and weapons glinted in the fading evening light, and Illyra felt her pulse quicken as she recognized the sheer scale of the threat now bearing down upon the stronghold she had come to consider home. Kaelin stood atop the main defensive wall, his commanding presence radiating authority despite the obvious danger of exposing himself so directly to the approaching enemy forces. Dorian remained close beside him, along with several senior commanders coordinating the defensive response, as Garrett's army continued its methodical advance across the open ground separating the tree line from the stronghold's outer walls. "Hold positions." Kaelin's voice carried clearly across the grounds, authority and calm control evident despite the mounting tension surrounding every person present. "Let them come to us. We have the defensive advantage here, and I intend to make full use of it." The approaching forces halted just beyond arrow range, and a single figure separated from the main group, riding forward with deliberate confidence that immediately identified him as Garrett Thorne himself. Illyra studied him from her position near the medical station, finally seeing in person the man whose betrayal had set this entire chain of events into motion. He appeared younger than she had expected, though something cold and calculating in his bearing confirmed every dangerous quality Kaelin had described during their journey together. "Kaelin," Garrett called out, his voice carrying easily across the distance separating the two forces, "I must admit, I'm impressed you survived. Truly, I underestimated your resilience. But surely you understand, this conflict can only end one way. Surrender your territory peacefully, and I promise your people will be spared unnecessary suffering." "You betrayed everything this alliance was built upon," Kaelin called back, his voice carrying barely restrained fury despite his controlled exterior. "Attacked me during what was meant to be a peaceful summit, hunted an innocent woman who did nothing more than show compassion to a stranger in need. There will be no surrender, Garrett. Only justice for the betrayal you've committed." Garrett's expression darkened at Kaelin's refusal, though he maintained his composed bearing despite the obvious rejection of his offer. "Then you leave me no choice," he said, his voice carrying cold finality. "I gave you the opportunity to avoid unnecessary bloodshed. What follows now rests entirely on your shoulders." With that, Garrett wheeled his mount around, retreating back toward his assembled forces, and moments later, the first wave of attackers surged forward across the open ground, toward the stronghold's defensive perimeter. Chaos erupted almost instantly, the careful preparations of previous days finally being tested against the reality of actual combat. Arrows arced through the darkening sky, as defenders positioned along the walls unleashed coordinated volleys against the advancing enemy forces, while others prepared to repel attackers who managed to reach the base of the stronghold's outer defenses. Illyra watched the initial exchange with growing tension, her hands instinctively clenching as she witnessed the violence unfolding before her, understanding that her own moment of direct involvement would arrive soon enough. The enemy forces pressed forward relentlessly despite significant losses during their initial approach, eventually reaching the outer walls where fierce, close-quarters combat erupted between defenders and attackers struggling for control of key defensive positions. Elira remained near the medical station initially, helping Miriam treat the first wave of wounded defenders brought back from the fighting, her training finally proving its worth, as she worked quickly and efficiently to stabilize injuries that would have overwhelmed her only weeks earlier. But as the battle intensified, word reached them that a section of the eastern wall had been breached, enemy forces pushing through in numbers that threatened to overwhelm the defenders stationed there. Elira felt a surge of protective urgency at the news, understanding immediately that additional support would be needed to prevent the breach from expanding into a full-scale collapse of that critical defensive position. "Go," Miriam said, seeming to read the decision forming in Elira's expression before she had even fully voiced it. "I can manage here. If you're needed elsewhere, don't hesitate." Elira nodded gratefully before rushing toward the eastern wall, her enhanced speed carrying her across the grounds, faster than would have been possible only weeks earlier. She arrived to find chaos, defenders struggling against a concentrated push of enemy fighters, who had indeed breached a section of the wall, creating a dangerous opening that threatened to allow Garrett's forces to flood directly into the stronghold's interior. Without hesitation, Elira threw herself into the fighting, her awakened abilities finally being tested in full, genuine combat, rather than the controlled training exercises she had practiced with Miriam. She moved with speed and precision that surprised even herself, deflecting attacks and delivering strikes that helped push back the concentrated enemy assault, threatening to overwhelm the defenders at that critical position. A particularly large attacker turned toward her, recognizing perhaps that she represented an unexpected threat among the defenders he had anticipated facing, and lunged forward with brutal intent. Elira reacted instinctively, her training with Miriam finally paying dividends as she evaded his initial strike and countered with a movement that sent him stumbling backward, giving nearby defenders the opening needed to finish subduing him effectively. The fighting continued in intense, brutal waves, defenders gradually managing to seal the breach and push the concentrated enemy assault back beyond the wall's perimeter, though the cost in wounded and exhausted fighters remained significant throughout the ongoing struggle. Elira found herself moving between direct combat and brief moments of tending to wounded allies whenever opportunities allowed, her dual role as both fighter and healer proving increasingly valuable as the extended conflict wore on. As the night deepened, the battle showed no signs of resolution, both sides locked in a fierce, exhausting struggle that tested every reserve of strength and determination the defenders possessed. Elira caught brief glimpses of Kaelin throughout the ongoing chaos, coordinating defenses from various critical positions, his leadership clearly instrumental in preventing Garrett's forces from achieving the decisive breakthrough they had clearly anticipated when launching their assault. Then, during a brief lull in the fighting near her position, Elira heard a commotion erupting from the direction of the main gate, shouts and the clash of weapons suggesting a renewed, concentrated push against that critical defensive point. Fear gripped her chest as she recognized Kaelin's voice among the commotion, and she rushed toward the sound, her heart pounding with dread at what she might find upon arrival. She reached the main gate to find a desperate struggle unfolding, Kaelin engaged in direct combat against several enemy fighters who had managed to breach the immediate defensive perimeter surrounding the gate itself. His movements, though skilled, carried visible signs of exhaustion after hours of continuous combat, and Elira's blood ran cold as she watched one of his opponents land a solid strike that staggered him backward, blood visible from a fresh wound along his arm. Without conscious thought, Elira surged forward, her enhanced speed carrying her directly into the fray, intercepting the follow-up attack that had been aimed at exploiting Kaelin's momentary vulnerability. She fought with fierce, protective intensity, her movements guided by instinct and training combined, buying Kaelin the crucial seconds he needed to recover his footing and rejoin the fight at full capacity. Together, they fought back-to-back against the remaining attackers, their combined efforts eventually overwhelming the enemy fighters who had breached the gate's perimeter, forcing the survivors to retreat back toward the main body of Garrett's forces, still positioned beyond the stronghold's walls. As the immediate threat subsided, Kaelin turned toward Elira, exhaustion and gratitude mixing in his expression, despite the ongoing chaos surrounding them. "You saved me," he said, breathless from the extended combat. We saved each other, Elira corrected. Her own breathing labored from the intense exertion of the fighting. Just like always. Their brief exchange was interrupted by another wave of shouts, this time carrying a different tone, one of surprise, rather than continued aggression. Both turned to see what had caused the sudden shift, and found, to their considerable surprise, forces bearing unfamiliar banners emerging from the tree line beyond Garrett's position, moving with clear hostile intent, though directed entirely against Garrett's forces rather than the stronghold's defenders. "Reinforcements," Dorian called out, rushing toward them with visible relief evident despite his own obvious exhaustion from the extended battle. "Allied packs, responding to the evidence of Garrett's betrayal we shared before this conflict began. They've arrived to support us against his forces." The tide of battle shifted dramatically as the newly arrived Allied forces struck against Garrett's army from an unexpected flank, the combined pressure finally proving too much for his forces to withstand. Chaos erupted among the enemy ranks as they found themselves caught between the stronghold's determined defenders and the unexpected arrival of additional hostile forces, their earlier confidence rapidly dissolving into desperate, disorganized retreat. Elira watched with growing hope as Garrett's forces began withdrawing from the field, the momentum that had carried their assault throughout the night finally broken by the combined resistance they now faced. But even as relief began settling over the exhausted defenders, she noticed something troubling amid the chaotic retreat. A small group of fighters, moving with different, more deliberate purpose than the general disorganized withdrawal surrounding them, breaking away from the main body of Garrett's retreating forces and moving instead directly toward the stronghold's interior, toward the very position where Kalen now stood. "Kalen," she shouted urgently, drawing his attention just as the small group of determined attackers surged forward, weapons raised, clearly intent on achieving through desperate final assault what their larger force had failed to accomplish through conventional battle. Kalen turned just in time to meet the first attacker's strike, his exhausted body responding with the trained precision that years of leadership and combat experience had ingrained deeply into his instincts. Elira rushed to join him, her enhanced abilities allowing her to intercept a second attacker before he could reach Kalen's exposed flank, deflecting the strike with enough force to send the man stumbling backward in surprise. The small group, though clearly skilled and determined, found themselves increasingly outmatched as Dorian and several nearby defenders rushed to support Kalen and Elira, the combined defensive response quickly overwhelming what had likely been intended as a final, desperate strike against pack leadership before Garrett's larger forces retreated entirely from the field. One by one, the attackers were subdued, disarmed, and secured, their desperate gambit having failed entirely against the coordinated response their assault provoked. As the last of the immediate attackers was restrained, Elira noticed something that made her blood run cold. Among the group, partially concealed beneath a dark cloak that had slipped during the struggle, she recognized the face of Garrett Thorne himself, apparently having chosen to lead this final, desperate assault personally, rather than simply retreating alongside his fleeing forces. "Garrett," Kalen said, his voice carrying cold satisfaction, despite his obvious exhaustion, as several guards moved quickly to restrain the defeated pack leader. "I suppose I should have expected you'd risk everything on one final, desperate attempt, rather than accepting defeat gracefully." Garrett struggled briefly against the guards restraining him, before finally going still, his expression twisting with barely controlled fury, and something closer to bitter resignation, as he recognized the completeness of his defeat. "This isn't over," he spat, though the hollow defiance in his voice suggested even he understood the truth behind his own words. "You may have won tonight, Kalen, but the council will hear my grievances. Your leadership, your judgment, questions will be raised." "The council will hear evidence of your betrayal," Kalen replied firmly. "Evidence gathered meticulously over these past weeks. Evidence that will leave no doubt about who truly threatens the stability and safety of these territories. Your ambition has cost you everything, Garrett, and there will be no sympathy extended for the suffering you've caused through your treachery." As guards led Garrett away toward secure confinement, the remaining sounds of battle finally began fading across the grounds, Allied forces and stronghold defenders working together to secure the field and tend to the wounded, scattered throughout the aftermath of the intense conflict. Elira felt exhaustion finally catching up with her, as adrenaline began draining from her system. The full weight of everything she had just experienced settling heavily over her both physically and emotionally. Kaelin turned toward her, his own exhaustion evident, despite the relief and satisfaction of their hard-won victory. "Are you hurt?" he asked, concern immediately overriding his own obvious fatigue, as he checked her carefully for any sign of injury sustained during the intense fighting. "Just tired," Elira assured him, though she leaned gratefully into the brief embrace he offered, both of them finally allowing themselves a moment to simply process the magnitude of what they had survived together. "We did it, Kaelin. We actually did it." "We did," he agreed, relief and pride evident in his voice as he studied her carefully. "And we couldn't have without you, Elira. Without your courage, your growing abilities, everything you've contributed since that very first night you found me bleeding in the snow. This victory belongs to you, as much as it belongs to me, or anyone else who fought tonight." As dawn began breaking over the battle-scarred grounds, illuminating the aftermath of the intense conflict that had raged throughout the night, the stronghold's defenders began the exhausting but necessary work of tending to wounded allies, securing captured enemy fighters, and beginning the process of restoring order following the chaotic violence that had consumed the previous hours. Elira moved among the wounded alongside Miriam, her medical training proving invaluable as the extent of injuries sustained during the fighting became fully apparent in the clear morning light. Despite the exhaustion weighing heavily over everyone involved, a sense of cautious hope had settled over the stronghold, the understanding that Garrett's betrayal had finally been exposed and defeated, bringing a measure of relief that had felt impossibly distant only days earlier. But as Elira worked to tend the wounded, she understood that the true resolution of this conflict remained incomplete. Garrett's capture represented significant progress, but the political challenges surrounding his exposure before the broader Pack Council, the process of reclaiming full stability and legitimacy for Kaelin's leadership, all of that work still remained ahead of them, waiting to unfold in the days and weeks that would follow this hard-fought, costly victory. Word of Garrett Thorne's defeat and capture spread rapidly throughout the Northern Pack's territories in the days following the battle, carried by messengers dispatched to every allied and neutral pack within reach. The response proved overwhelming, pack leaders from across the region expressing both relief at Kaelin's survival and outrage at the depths of betrayal Garrett had demonstrated through his actions. Within a week, arrangements had been finalized for a formal council gathering, where evidence of Garrett's treachery would be presented before Pack leadership from throughout the territories, and where his fate would ultimately be determined according to ancient traditions governing such serious violations of Pack law. Elira found herself swept into the preparations, alongside Kaelin and his senior advisors, her role within Pack affairs having evolved dramatically since the desperate night she had first discovered him bleeding in the snow outside her isolated cabin. She now sat among trusted advisors during strategic discussions, her insights valued and respected by Pack members who had initially regarded her human origins with understandable skepticism. "The council will convene in 3 days," Dorian reported during one such meeting, reviewing final preparations with characteristic thoroughness. "Representatives from every allied Pack territory have confirmed attendance, along with several neutral parties whose judgment carries significant weight in matters of this severity." "And Garrett?" Kaelin asked, though his tone suggested he already anticipated the answer given their captive's behavior since his capture. "Unrepentant," Dorian confirmed grimly. "He continues insisting his actions were justified, that your leadership has grown weak, that the territories require stronger guidance than what he claims you've provided. I doubt the council will find such arguments compelling, particularly given the overwhelming evidence of his betrayal, but his continued defiance suggests he may attempt some final gambit during the formal proceedings." Kaelin's expression hardened at this assessment. "Then we ensure our evidence remains airtight, and that nothing he might attempt during the proceedings can undermine the legitimacy of what we've already established. This council gathering needs to conclude this conflict definitively, leaving no room for lingering questions or doubts that might embolden others who share his ambitions." The following days passed in intense preparation, evidence carefully organized and reviewed, testimonies from witnesses documented thoroughly, and every detail of the formal proceedings planned with meticulous attention. Elira found herself increasingly nervous as the council gathering approached, understanding that her own testimony regarding the events of that first desperate night, and everything that had followed, would likely play a significant role in the proceedings. "You'll do wonderfully," Miriam assured her, during a quiet moment, the evening before the council was scheduled to convene. Sensing the anxiety Elira had been struggling to conceal. Simply speak the truth, as you experienced it, Elira. That honesty carries more weight than any elaborate testimony could ever achieve. It's not just the testimony that worries me, Elira admitted. It's everything else. Standing before pack leaders from territories I've never even heard of, representing something significant to Kaylin's future, to this entire community. I still feel like I'm learning what all of this truly means. You've learned remarkably quickly, Miriam said warmly. And whatever uncertainty you feel, remember that you've already proven yourself far beyond what mere words in a council chamber could ever fully capture. Trust in everything you've accomplished these past weeks, and the rest will follow naturally. The morning of the council gathering arrived with a clarity and crispness that seemed to underscore the significance of the proceedings ahead. The Stronghold's Great Hall had been transformed for the occasion, pack leaders and their advisors from throughout the Northern Territories filling seats, arranged in a formal semicircle, facing a central area where evidence would be presented and testimony given. Elira sat near the front, alongside Kaylin and his senior advisors, acutely aware of the weight of scrutiny from dozens of unfamiliar faces, studying her with varying degrees of curiosity and assessment. The proceedings began formally, an elder statesman from a neutral pack territory, presiding over the gathering with practiced authority, outlining the serious nature of the accusations against Garrett Thorne, and the process through which evidence and testimony would be presented before final judgment was rendered. Garrett himself sat under heavy guard, his expression carrying defiant anger, despite the overwhelming evidence that would soon be laid before the assembled council. Dorian presented the initial evidence first, detailed accounts of the ambush at the original summit, documentation of the silver weapons used in the assassination attempt, and testimony from surviving witnesses who had observed the coordinated nature of the attack that could only have been orchestrated with significant advance planning. The assembled council listened intently, expressions growing increasingly grave as the scope of Garrett's betrayal became fully apparent through the carefully organized presentation. When called to provide her own testimony, Elira rose and moved to the designated position before the assembled council, her heart racing, despite the calm exterior she worked hard to maintain. She recounted the events of that first desperate night, finding Kaylin bleeding in the snow, the silver bullets she had extracted from his wounds, and the danger that had followed them throughout their journey toward the safety of the stronghold. Her voice remained steady throughout the account, the truth of her experience carrying its own inherent weight before the assembled pack leaders. You extracted silver directly from his wounds with your bare hands? One council member asked, skepticism evident in his tone as he studied Elira carefully. Without any prior knowledge of pack medicine, without any training in treating such specific injuries? I used remedies my grandmother taught me, Elira explained. At the time, I had no understanding of what I was truly treating, or why the wounds behaved so differently from ordinary injuries. I simply did everything within my power to help someone who desperately needed it. Her testimony continued, detailing the subsequent discovery of her own heritage, the awakening of abilities during the ambush they had survived together, and her subsequent training under Miriam's careful guidance. The council listened with growing interest, several members exchanging meaningful glances as the significance of her healer bloodline became apparent within the broader context of the proceedings. Garrett, given opportunity to respond to the evidence and testimony presented against him, launched into a defense that grew increasingly desperate as the proceedings continued. He argued that Kaylin's leadership had grown weak, that alliance with a human woman, regardless of any hidden bloodline she might possess, represented a dangerous departure from proper pack tradition that justified his actions in attempting to seize control of territories he believed required stronger, more decisive leadership. This council should be questioning Kaylin's judgment, Garrett insisted, his voice carrying desperate conviction despite the mounting evidence against him, not condemning me for recognizing weakness that threatens the stability of every territory under his supposed protection. The presiding elder allowed Garrett's argument to conclude, before addressing the assembled council directly. The evidence presented today demonstrates clearly that Garrett Thorne orchestrated a premeditated assassination attempt against Alpha King Kaylin Voss during what was meant to be a peaceful diplomatic summit, he stated formally. This council must now determine appropriate judgment based on the severity of this betrayal and based on the ancient laws governing such violations of pack trust and territorial sovereignty. Deliberation followed, pack leaders from throughout the territories conferring quietly among themselves before the presiding elder called the gathering back to formal order. This council finds Garrett Thorne guilty of premeditated betrayal against pack law, he announced, his voice carrying solemn finality. His territory and title are hereby stripped, transferred to leadership deemed loyal and appropriate by this council's judgment. He will face permanent exile from these territories, forbidden from ever again claiming leadership or influence within any pack governed by this council's authority. Garrett's expression twisted with fury at the judgment, though the guards restraining him ensured any outburst remained contained as he was led from the great hall to begin the process of his formal exile. Alira felt relief flooding through her at the conclusion of the proceedings, understanding that the immediate threat that had dominated the past several weeks of her life had finally been resolved through legitimate, formal justice, rather than continued violence. But the council's business had not fully concluded. The presiding elder turned his attention back toward Kaelin, his expression shifting into something more contemplative as he addressed the broader implications of everything that had unfolded during the proceedings. There remains one additional matter this council should address, he said. The testimony provided today revealed the existence of a previously unknown healer bloodline, one thought extinct for generations, now confirmed alive within the woman who saved Alpha King Kaelin's life, and subsequently proved instrumental in defending this territory against Garrett's forces. All eyes in the great hall turned toward Alira, and she felt her pulse quicken under the weight of renewed scrutiny, uncertain what significance this acknowledgement might carry within the formal proceedings unfolding around her. Elder Miriam, the presiding official continued, please share with this council your assessment of the significance surrounding this discovery. Miriam rose from her seat, addressing the assembled council with the quiet authority her position as elder and healer commanded. The healer bloodlines held sacred significance within our ancient traditions, she explained, particularly regarding the bond formed between such bloodlines and those who hold positions of pack leadership. Based on everything I've observed during Alira's training, and based on the remarkable events these past weeks have demonstrated, I believe her bond with Alpha King Kaelin Voss represents exactly the kind of true bond our oldest traditions describe, a connection that strengthens leadership and territorial stability in ways that extend far beyond simple personal affection. Murmurs spread through the assembled council at this declaration, various leaders exchanging thoughtful glances as they considered the implications of Miriam's assessment. Kaelin rose from his seat, moving to stand beside Alira, his expression carrying determined resolve despite the formal, public nature of the moment unfolding before them. This council has witnessed today the full scope of Garrett's betrayal and the courage and sacrifice demonstrated by Alira Ward throughout every stage of this conflict, Kaelin said, his voice carrying clear conviction as he addressed the assembled pack leaders directly. I intend to formally claim her as my mate, according to the oldest traditions our ancestors established regarding bonds between Alpha and healer bloodlines. I ask this council to recognize and honor that bond, regardless of any hesitation some might feel, given her unconventional path into our world. The great hall fell into contemplative silence as the assembled leaders considered Kaelin's formal declaration, several exchanging quiet words with their advisors before the presiding elder finally spoke again. Given the evidence presented today, given the courage and loyalty demonstrated repeatedly throughout this crisis, and given the confirmed presence of authentic healer bloodline heritage within Alira Ward's lineage, this council recognizes and honors the bond claimed by Alpha King Kaelin Voss. May this union bring strength and stability to these territories for generations to come. Alira felt overwhelming emotion flooding through her as the formal recognition was announced, the weight of everything that had unfolded since that first desperate, frozen night, finally settling into something that felt remarkably like belonging, like the beginning of a future she could never have imagined when her ordinary, isolated life had first collided with extraordinary danger and possibility. Kaelin turned toward her, warmth and love evident in his expression despite the formal, public setting surrounding their moment of recognition. Thank you, he said softly, meaning far more than simple gratitude for her testimony or her role in defeating Garrett's forces. For everything, Alira. For saving my life. For embracing a world entirely foreign to everything you knew before. And for choosing, again and again, to stand beside me, despite every danger and uncertainty that choice demanded. "I would choose it again," Alira replied, her voice thick with emotion despite the composed exterior she had maintained throughout the formal proceedings. "Every single time, Kaelin, without hesitation." As the council gathering finally concluded, pack leaders from throughout the territories approaching to offer congratulations and formal acknowledgement of the newly recognized bond, Alira understood that while significant challenges undoubtedly still awaited them, the immediate crisis that had defined her life since that fateful winter night had finally reached genuine resolution. Whatever came next, whatever responsibilities and adjustments her new position within pack society would demand, she faced that future with the same courage and determination that had carried her through every impossible circumstance since the moment she had first found a wounded stranger bleeding in the snow outside her home. Not every voice within the Great Hall carried the same warmth toward the council's decision, however. As the formal proceedings drew to their close, and attendees began mingling in smaller groups throughout the hall, an older pack leader from one of the more traditional northern territories approached Kaelin and Alira with an expression that carried more reservation than celebration. "Alpha King," the man said, offering a respectful nod toward Kaelin, before turning his attention toward Alira with evident scrutiny. "I mean no disrespect toward the council's decision, but I must voice a concern shared by several among us. This woman's bloodline was confirmed only through testimony and observation these past weeks. Is it truly wise to formalize such a significant bond before more thorough verification can be completed?" Kaelin's expression remained composed, despite the challenge evident in the older leader's words, though Alira sensed the protective tension immediately settling into his posture. "Elder Marcus," Kaelin replied, using the man's proper title with careful respect despite the underlying disagreement. "I understand caution feels appropriate given the significance of this decision, but I would remind you that Alira's abilities have already been demonstrated repeatedly, under genuine, dangerous circumstances no fabricated testimony could adequately replicate. Her courage during the battle against Garrett's forces alone should offer sufficient verification of everything Miriam's assessment has already confirmed." The elder considered this response carefully, his expression softening slightly though skepticism remained evident beneath his measured tone. "Perhaps," he acknowledged, "though I would suggest, respectfully, that time will ultimately provide the clearest verification of any bond's true strength and legitimacy. I wish you both well, regardless of my reservations, but I hope you understand that not every leader within these territories will accept this decision without continued observation, and, perhaps, some measure of ongoing skepticism." "I understand your position," Alira said, speaking directly to the elder for the first time since he had approached them, her voice carrying steady confidence, despite the underlying challenge in his words. "I don't expect trust to be granted automatically, simply because a council has recognized a bond between myself and Kaelin. I hope, through my continued actions and commitment to this community, to earn that trust properly over time, rather than demanding it be extended without reasonable basis." Something shifted in the elder's expression at her response, respect gradually replacing his earlier skepticism as he studied her more carefully. "Well spoken," he said finally, offering a slight, genuine smile despite his earlier reservations. "Perhaps this bond carries more legitimacy than my initial caution suggested. Time will tell, as I said, but I find myself somewhat more optimistic than I was upon first hearing today's proceedings." As the elder departed to rejoin other attendees throughout the hall, Kaelin turned toward Alira, quiet pride evident in his expression, despite the lingering tension from the brief confrontation. "You handled that beautifully," he said. "Better than I likely would have managed, honestly. My instinct was to defend you more forcefully, but your response carried far more weight than anything I might have said in your place." "I meant every word," Alira replied. "I don't expect everyone to simply accept me without question, Kaelin. Building trust takes time, and I'm prepared for that process, however long it might require." Their conversation was interrupted by Dorian's approach, his expression carrying the satisfied relief of someone whose careful strategic planning had finally yielded the successful resolution he had worked so hard to achieve. "The council session has concluded successfully," he reported. "Garrett's exile will be formalized within the week, and leadership of his former territory will transfer to his cousin, a woman whose loyalty and judgment our intelligence suggests we can trust considerably more than we could ever trust Garrett himself." "Good," Kaelin said, relief evident in his own exhausted expression, as the full weight of the resolved crisis finally began settling over him properly. Then perhaps, finally, we can begin looking toward rebuilding and stability, rather than constant crisis and conflict. There will be adjustments required, certainly, Dorian acknowledged. Restructuring alliances, rebuilding trust with territories that Garrett's betrayal has left uncertain about broader pack stability. But nothing insurmountable, particularly with the demonstrated strength of leadership you've shown throughout this entire crisis, Kalen, and with Alira's presence beside you, offering exactly the kind of stability and legitimacy the old traditions suggest such bonds provide. As the Great Hall gradually emptied throughout the remainder of the afternoon, pack leaders and their advisors departing to begin the journey back toward their respective territories, Alira found herself standing quietly beside Kalen near one of the hall's tall windows, watching the activity outside as preparations began for what would undoubtedly become a significant celebration, marking both Garrett's defeat and the formal recognition of their bond. "It's strange," she said quietly, thinking back to that first night, finding you bleeding in the snow, having no idea what any of this would eventually lead to. If someone had told me then that I would end up here, formally recognized before pack leaders from across multiple territories, I would have thought them entirely mad. "Life rarely follows the paths we expect," Kalen replied, wrapping an arm gently around her shoulders as they both continued watching the activity outside. "But I find myself deeply grateful for whatever combination of circumstance and fate brought you to that exact spot, at that exact moment, when I needed help most desperately. Whatever comes next, Alira, I believe we're prepared to face it together, stronger for everything we've already overcome." Alira leaned into his embrace, comfort and quiet joy settling over her, despite the exhaustion of the intense proceedings they had just navigated successfully. Whatever challenges still awaited them, whatever adjustments and continued skepticism they might face from traditionalist voices within pack society, she felt genuine confidence that together, they possessed exactly the strength and determination required to build the kind of future both of them had begun envisioning since their unlikely paths had first collided during that desperate frozen night many weeks earlier. Spring arrived across the northern pack's territories with a warmth that felt symbolic of everything the past several months had brought, the harsh, dangerous winter that had begun with Kalen's desperate flight through frozen forest, finally giving way to renewal and genuine hope for the future. The stronghold that had once echoed with the sounds of battle now buzzed with entirely different energy, preparations underway for a celebration that would formally mark both the restoration of stable leadership throughout the territories and the joining of Alpha King Kalen Voss with his chosen mate before the full community he now served. Alira stood before a mirror in a private chamber adjacent to the Great Hall, studying her reflection with a mixture of nervousness and quiet wonder at how completely her life had transformed since that fateful winter night. The dress she wore had been carefully crafted by pack artisans, deep blue fabric, embroidered with silver thread that formed subtle wolf motifs along the hem and sleeves, a design chosen to honor both her human heritage and the ancient healer bloodline that had finally awakened within her blood. "You look beautiful," Miriam said, entering the chamber with a warm smile, her own formal attire reflecting the significance of the occasion they were preparing to celebrate. "Nervous?" "Terrified," Alira admitted with a small laugh, though genuine joy remained evident beneath her nervous energy. "I never imagined my life would lead here, Miriam. Standing before an entire community, formally joining with someone I've come to love so completely, in a world I couldn't have even conceived of existing only months ago. Life has a way of leading us toward exactly where we're meant to be," Miriam said gently, "even when the path there defies every expectation we might have held previously. You've earned this moment, Alira, through everything you've faced and overcome. Trust in that, and everything else will follow naturally." A knock sounded at the chamber door, and Dorian's voice called through, informing them that the ceremony was ready to begin. Alira took a steadying breath, gratitude and anticipation mixing together as Miriam offered one final reassuring smile before they made their way toward the Great Hall, where the community had gathered to witness the formal celebration of her bond with Kalen. The hall had been transformed since the tense council proceedings months earlier, decorated now with flowers and warm lighting that created an atmosphere of joy rather than the solemn gravity of formal justice. Pack members from throughout the territory filled the space, along with representatives from allied packs who had traveled significant distances to witness this celebration of restored stability and legitimate leadership throughout the Northern Territories. Kaelin stood waiting near the front of the gathered crowd, dressed formally in attire that reflected his position, while carrying none of the exhausted, wounded desperation that had characterized their first meeting so many months earlier. His expression, upon seeing Alira enter the hall, carried such open warmth and love that any remaining nervousness she felt seemed to dissolve entirely, replaced by quiet, steady confidence as she made her way toward him through the assembled crowd. The ceremony itself followed ancient traditions that Miriam had carefully explained during the preceding weeks. Formal vows exchanged before the community, acknowledgement of the healer bloodline heritage that had made this particular bond so significant within Pact tradition, and finally, the formal declaration that joined them together not merely as mates, but as partners whose combined strength would guide and protect the territories moving forward. "Alira Ward," Kaelin said, his voice carrying clearly through the attentive hall. "From the moment you found me bleeding in the snow, refusing to turn away, despite every reasonable instinct that might have counseled caution, you demonstrated exactly the courage and compassion I have come to treasure beyond measure. You embraced a world entirely foreign to everything you knew, discovered strength within your own blood you never imagined possible, and stood beside me through danger that would have driven away anyone less remarkable. I promise to honor and protect you, to value your counsel and strength as partner rather than simply consort, and to build alongside you a future worthy of everything we've already overcome together." Alira felt tears gathering as she listened to his heartfelt vows, the depth of emotion evident in every word, carrying weight far beyond formal ceremony. When it came time for her own vows, she found the words flowing naturally, drawn from genuine feeling rather than rehearsed formality. "Kaelin," she said, meeting his eyes directly despite the audience surrounding them, "I never expected my life to lead toward any of this. I was content, or so I believed, with the quiet, isolated existence I had built for myself. But finding you that night changed everything, not just because of the danger and adventure that followed, but because you showed me a version of myself I never knew existed, courage and strength I had no idea I carried within my own blood. I promise to stand beside you always, to offer whatever healing and strength my heritage provides, and to build with you a partnership that honors both the traditions of your world and the compassion that first brought us together." As their formal vows concluded, Miriam stepped forward to complete the traditional bonding ritual, her voice carrying solemn authority as she invoked words passed down through generations of Pact tradition, formally recognizing and sealing the bond between Alpha and Healer bloodline before the assembled community. When the ritual concluded, the Great Hall erupted into celebration, cheers and applause filling the space, as Pact members and allied representatives alike acknowledged the joyful conclusion of a journey that had begun in such desperate, dangerous circumstances months earlier. The celebration continued long into the evening, music and laughter filling the stronghold's grounds, as the community gathered to honor both the restored stability of proper leadership and the joyful union that promised continued strength for the territories moving forward. Alira found herself surrounded by well-wishers throughout the evening, Pact members who had once regarded her with understandable wariness, now offering genuine warmth and acceptance, their trust earned gradually through months of demonstrated commitment and courage. Even Elder Marcus, the traditionalist leader who had voiced skepticism during the earlier council proceedings, approached during the celebration with an expression that carried genuine warmth rather than lingering doubt. "I owe you an apology," he said to Alira, his tone sincere despite the formal setting. "The skepticism I voiced months ago has been thoroughly disproven by everything you've demonstrated since. This territory is fortunate to have gained someone of your character and strength." "Thank you," Alira replied, genuine gratitude evident in her response. "Your caution wasn't unreasonable, given everything at stake. I'm simply glad I could prove worthy of the trust this community has gradually extended." As the celebration continued around them, Kaelin found a quiet moment to pull Alira aside, leading her toward a private balcony overlooking the grounds where the festivities continued below. The evening air carried the fresh scent of spring, a stark contrast to the frozen, dangerous winter night when their paths had first collided. "Happy?" he asked, studying her expression carefully, as they stood together, overlooking the celebration. "More than I ever imagined possible," Alira replied honestly, leaning into his embrace as they watched the joyful scene below. "It's strange, thinking back to that first night. I remember being so frightened, so uncertain about what I was doing, dragging a wounded stranger into my home, despite having no idea what I was truly getting involved in. If I could go back and tell myself what that decision would eventually lead to, I don't think I would have believed it. I'm endlessly grateful you made that choice, Kaylin said softly, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. Whatever path led us here, whatever combination of fate and circumstance brought you to that exact spot when I needed help most desperately, I will spend the rest of my life grateful for it. They stood together in comfortable silence for a while longer, watching the celebration continue below, both reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had carried them from that desperate winter night through danger, discovery, and ultimately, toward the genuine happiness and stability they now shared. Elira thought of her grandmother, wondering if somewhere, in whatever way such things might work, she could see the remarkable path her granddaughter's life had taken. The ancient bloodline finally awakened and honored exactly as tradition suggested it always should have been. What happens now? Elira asked eventually, curiosity mixing with quiet contentment as she considered the future stretching ahead of them. Beyond tonight, I mean. What does our life together actually look like moving forward? Whatever we choose to build, Kaylin replied, warmth evident in his voice, despite the genuine consideration he gave her question. There will be challenges, certainly. Leadership never comes without difficulty, and rebuilding full trust and stability throughout these territories will require continued effort and patience. But I believe, with you beside me, offering both your growing strength and the wisdom your unique perspective provides, we can build something genuinely remarkable here. Together, Elira said softly, meeting his eyes with quiet certainty, despite the uncertainty that still surrounded whatever specific challenges the future might bring. Together, Kaylin agreed, pulling her into a warm embrace as the celebration continued below them, the sounds of joy and music drifting up through the spring evening air. As the night deepened and the celebration gradually wound toward its natural conclusion, Elira found herself reflecting on the remarkable transformation her life had undergone since that first desperate encounter in the frozen forest. She had begun as an isolated, ordinary woman, living quietly on the edges of a world she never knew existed, and had emerged, through courage, discovery, and genuine love, as someone whose strength and compassion had proven essential to restoring peace and stability throughout an entire territory. The Alpha King, who had once believed her simply human, who had hidden his true nature out of necessity and caution, now stood beside her as genuine partner, their bond recognized and celebrated by an entire community that had learned to see beyond surface appearances toward the true strength and character that mattered most. Whatever challenges the future held, whatever adjustments and continued growth their partnership would require, Elira faced that uncertain future with confidence, born from everything they had already overcome together. The winter that had brought them together through such desperate, dangerous circumstances had given way to spring, and with it, to a future filled with genuine promise, built upon a foundation of courage, discovery, and love that had transformed both their lives in ways neither could have ever anticipated when their paths first collided beneath a moonlit, snow-covered sky. Months later, as summer settled fully over the northern territories, Elira found herself standing once again near the training area, where her journey toward understanding her own heritage had truly begun, though now she stood not as a student, but as an instructor herself, guiding several young pack members who had recently discovered similar dormant healer abilities within their own bloodlines. Word of her story had spread throughout the territories, inspiring several families to investigate old family legends they had previously dismissed as simple folklore, resulting in the discovery of additional healer bloodline descendants scattered throughout various pack communities. "You're doing wonderfully," she told a young woman named Nora, watching as her student successfully completed an exercise that had taken Elira herself considerably longer to master during her own early training. "Miriam would be proud of your progress." "I still can't believe any of this is real," Nora admitted, echoing sentiments Elira remembered feeling so vividly during her own early days of discovery. "A month ago, I thought my grandmother's stories were simply entertaining nonsense. Now here I am, training alongside the very woman whose courage helped restore peace throughout these entire territories." Elira smiled warmly at the young woman's words, memories of her own uncertain beginning still fresh, despite everything that had unfolded since. "Trust me," she said, I understand exactly how overwhelming this discovery feels, but you'll find, as I did, that this heritage brings more than simply strange new abilities. It connects you to something larger, a community, and tradition that stretches back generations, waiting patiently to be rediscovered. As the training session concluded, Illyra made her way back toward the main stronghold, pausing briefly to appreciate the peaceful, thriving community that had emerged from the chaos and danger of the previous winter. Children played in the courtyard, where fierce battle had once raged. Pack members moved about their daily responsibilities with the relaxed confidence of genuine security, rather than the watchful tension that had characterized those difficult months of conflict and uncertainty. She found Kalen in his study, reviewing correspondence from allied territories with Dorian, both men looking up as she entered, warmth immediately evident in Kalen's expression at her arrival. "How did training go?" he asked, setting aside the documents he had been reviewing. "Wonderfully," Illyra replied, settling into a chair near his desk. "Nora's progress continues to impress me. I think within another few months, she'll be ready to begin more advanced techniques." "The Healer Bloodline program has proven remarkably successful," Dorian added, satisfaction evident in his tone. "Several allied territories have requested guidance in identifying and training their own dormant bloodline descendants, based entirely on the success we've demonstrated here." "It's remarkable, honestly," Kalen said, pride evident in his voice as he studied Illyra with open admiration. "What began as personal discovery about your own heritage has grown into something benefiting territories throughout the entire region. You've built something genuinely significant here, Illyra, beyond even our own partnership." Illyra felt warmth spreading through her chest at his words, genuine satisfaction settling over her as she considered how completely her life's purpose had transformed since that desperate winter night so many months earlier. What had begun as simple compassion toward a wounded stranger had evolved into a role that extended far beyond her own personal journey, touching the lives of countless others throughout the broader Pack community. Later that evening, as they walked together along the same stronghold wall where Kalen had first confessed his growing feelings for her months earlier, Illyra found herself reflecting on everything the past year had brought. Garrett Thorne remained in permanent exile, his ambitions thoroughly defeated, while his former territory thrived under the more balanced, trustworthy leadership that had replaced him. The Healer Bloodline program continued expanding, offering hope and purpose to individuals throughout the region who had previously lived unaware of their true heritage. And her own bond with Kalen had only deepened with each passing month, their partnership proving exactly as strong and stable as the ancient traditions had promised. "Do you ever think about that first night?" she asked Kalen as they paused near the section of wall overlooking the peaceful forest surrounding their territory. "About how differently everything might have unfolded if I hadn't happened to be exactly where I was, exactly when you needed help most desperately." "Constantly," Kalen admitted, wrapping an arm gently around her shoulders as they both gazed out over the moonlit landscape. "Though I've come to believe there was something more than simple chance guiding that particular night's events. Perhaps it was fate. Perhaps something connected to the ancient bond our traditions describe, recognizing something significant in you, long before either of us fully understood what that significance would eventually mean." Illyra leaned into his embrace, contentment settling over her, as she considered the remarkable journey that had carried her from isolated, ordinary existence toward the genuine purpose and love she now shared with the man beside her. "Whatever guided us together that night," she said softly, "I'm endlessly grateful for it. Every challenge, every danger, every difficult moment along the way, it all led us here, to exactly where we're meant to be." Kalen pressed a gentle kiss to her temple, both of them falling into comfortable, contented silence, as they continued watching the peaceful forest stretching out before them, the same forest that had once held such desperate danger, now representing nothing more than the quiet, thriving territory they had worked so hard to protect and restore. Whatever challenges the future might still bring, whatever new discoveries and adjustments their continued partnership would require, they faced that future together, bound by love, loyalty, and a heritage that had proven far more remarkable than either could have ever imagined when their paths first collided beneath that frozen, moonlit winter sky. Their story, one that began with desperate flight through snow-covered forest and silver bullets meant to end a king's life, had transformed into something far greater than either had anticipated, A partnership built on courage, discovery, and love, strong enough to restore peace throughout an entire territory. And strong enough, they both believed with quiet, unwavering confidence, to carry them through whatever adventures and challenges still awaited them in the years ahead.